On the morning of August 4, 1892, in the sweltering heat of Fall River, Massachusetts, Andrew Borden's skull was split open by 19 savage blows from a hatchet. His daughter Lizzie stood in the next room, claiming she heard nothing. Not a scream, not a struggle, not the sickening thud of blade against bone. She wasn't the only wife or daughter of the Gilded Age to watch a wealthy man die. She was simply the most famous, the most whispered about, the most immortalized in children's rhymes that parents still teach without understanding what they mean. What you think you know about these women is almost certainly wrong. The newspapers lied, the history books sanitized, and the truth, the documented, testified, blood-soaked truth, is far more disturbing than any legend. Are you ready to meet the women who turned, till death do us part, into a promise they kept personally? Lizzie wasn't alone. She wasn't an aberration. She wasn't a monster born from nothing. Between 1889 and 1928, a wave of wealthy women, Florence Maybrick in Liverpool, Maria Barbella in New York, Ruth Snyder in Queens, stood accused of murdering the men who had sworn to protect them, the men who had promised them comfort, the men who held the keys to their cages. Arsenic stirred into morning tea, a straight razor drawn across an exposed throat, a sash weight swung against a sleeping skull. These weren't crimes of poverty or desperation, at least not the kind of desperation that shows in worn shoes and empty cupboards. These were crimes committed in parlors with lace curtains, by women wearing pearls. Crimes planned in bedrooms with silk sheets. Crimes executed with the same precision these women applied to managing households and maintaining appearances. And each case asked the same impossible question, a question that judges, juries, and historians have never satisfactorily answered. What makes a wife become a widow by her own hand? What breaks inside a woman who has everything society said she should want? Perhaps the answer is simpler than we'd like to believe. Perhaps having everything society offers isn't the same as having anything you actually need. In the next 100 minutes, you'll discover the arsenic-laced love affair that destroyed one of Liverpool's most prominent families, a scandal so explosive that it generated 500,000 petition signatures and nearly toppled the British legal system. You'll witness the 40 whacks that made Lizzie Borden a legend, and you'll understand why the jury that heard the evidence still set her free. We'll meet the immigrant woman who became the first person sentenced to die in New York's electric chair for the crime of fighting back against a man who destroyed her. And you'll see the insurance scheme so brazen, so coldly calculated, that the killers posed for photographs at the crime scene. A minute 20, you'll see the letter Florence Maybrick wrote to her lover that sealed her fate, and you'll understand why the jury ignored evidence that might have saved her, choosing instead to punish her for the crime of loving the wrong man. A minute 50, you'll meet the lover who testified against Ruth Snyder and walked free while she burned in the electric chair. A man so weak that he couldn't refuse her demands, yet strong enough to betray her when his own life hung in the balance. And by the end, you'll understand why the most dangerous place for a wealthy man in the Gilded Age wasn't a dark alley, wasn't a gambling den, wasn't even a battlefield. It was his own bedroom, with the woman he married sleeping beside him, or pretending to sleep. This isn't tabloid speculation dressed up as history. This isn't the sanitized version printed in school books, where women are either angels or monsters with nothing in between. This isn't gossip passed down through generations until it becomes indistinguishable from fiction. This is documented truth. Trial transcripts that run thousands of pages, recording every objection, every sob, every damning piece of evidence. Autopsy reports that detail every wound with clinical precision, the angle of the blade, the force of impact, the time it took to die. Love letters that were never meant to be read in open court, now preserved in archives where anyone can examine the handwriting of the desperate and the doomed. Newspaper accounts from journalists who sat in those courtrooms, who watched these women fight for their lives, who recorded the gasps of the gallery and the tears of the condemned. What emerges from these documents is a pattern as disturbing as it is undeniable. Marriage in the Gilded Age wasn't always a sanctuary. For many women, it was the only option. For some women, it was a prison. And for a few unfortunate men, it was a death sentence signed on their wedding day. Let's begin in Liverpool, England, in 1889, with a young American bride who allegedly served her husband arsenic for breakfast, and who would become the most hated woman in the British Empire before she turned 30. Florence Elizabeth Chandler was born on September 3, 1862, in Mobile, Alabama, a city of white columns and magnolia blossoms, where the memory of the Old South lingered like perfume in the heavy air. Her father, William Chandler, had served as a colonel in the Confederate Army, fighting for a cause that crumbled around him even as his daughter took her first breaths. He was a man of principle, they said, a man of modest means. A man who died before Florence was old enough to remember his face. Her mother, Caroline, was made of different material entirely. Caroline understood something that her idealistic husband never grasped. Principles don't pay for silk dresses. Honor doesn't secure invitations to the right parties, and a widow with a beautiful daughter has exactly one asset worth cultivating. After William's death, Caroline remarried strategically, first to a German baron, acquiring a title that opened doors across Europe. The Baroness von Roques, she styled herself, navigating the social waters of Paris and London with her beautiful daughter in tow like a ship's figurehead, designed to attract attention and inspire admiration. Young Florence learned her lessons well. She was educated in convents where nuns taught her to pray and tutors taught her to please. She was trained in the arts of conversation, how to listen with apparent fascination, how to laugh at the right moments, how to make a man feel brilliant simply by asking the right questions. She was presented in the finest drawing rooms on 2 continents, displayed like merchandise in a shop window, waiting for a buyer with sufficient funds. At the time she was 17, Florence Chandler was a weapon, polished and ready for deployment. Her dark hair cascaded in the Gibson girl style that would become fashionable a decade later. Her violet eyes, unusual, memorable, impossible to forget, drew attention in every ballroom. Her southern charm, that careful blend of sweetness and steel, made her irresistible to men of a certain age and income bracket. Her mother had one mission: find a wealthy husband before Florence's youth became a memory. The hunt was on, and the prey was already in sight. He found James Maybrick on a transatlantic voyage in 1880, a wealthy Liverpool cotton broker, 23 years Florence's senior. His fortune promised security. His age suggested he might not live long enough to become inconvenient. They married within a year. Neither of them could have predicted that 9 years later, James would die in agony, his body riddled with arsenic, his young wife standing accused of murder. Neither of them could have imagined that Florence would become the most hated woman in the British Empire, convicted in a trial so biased that legal scholars still cite it as an example of justice gone catastrophically wrong. But perhaps they should have predicted it. Perhaps the seeds of tragedy were planted the moment a 17-year-old girl was taught that marriage was not about love, but about survival. Perhaps Florence Maybrick was a murderer, or perhaps she was simply a woman who learned her lessons too well. Florence Elizabeth Chandler entered the world on September 3, 1862 in Mobile, Alabama, a city still clinging to antebellum grandeur even as the Confederacy crumbled around it. The streets smelled of jasmine and defeat. The grand houses still stood, though their owners no longer had the slaves to maintain them. It was a world of pretense, of maintaining appearances even when the foundations had rotted away. Her father, William Chandler, served as a colonel in the Confederate Army. He was a man of principle, which is another way of saying he was a man who cared more about being right than being wealthy. When he died, he left his widow and daughter with precisely nothing: a good name, impeccable breeding, and not enough money to maintain either. Her mother, Caroline, was made of different material entirely. Caroline understood something that her idealistic husband never grasped. The world is not kind to principled women without resources. A widow could mourn beautifully, but mourning didn't pay for dresses. Grief didn't secure advantageous marriages, and a young daughter with no dowry would quickly become a burden rather than an asset. So Caroline reinvented herself with the ruthlessness of a survivor. She remarried strategically, first to a German baron, acquiring a title that transformed her from a Confederate widow into the Baroness von Roques. Doors that had been firmly closed suddenly swung open. Drawing rooms in Paris welcomed her. Dinner parties in London sought her presence. She had become someone simply by changing her name. And she took Florence everywhere. Young Florence learned her lessons in the cruelest classroom imaginable, watching her mother transform herself from a woman with nothing into a woman with everything society valued. She learned that beauty was currency. She learned that charm was negotiable. She learned that a well-placed smile could open doors that money couldn't unlock. She was educated in convents across Europe, where nuns taught her piety and governesses taught her practicality. She learned French, German, the proper way to pour tea, and the improper way to catch a man's attention without appearing to try. She was trained in music, in art, in all the accomplishments expected of a woman who would never be expected to accomplish anything meaningful. By the time she was 17, Florence Chandler was a weapon, polished, sharpened, and ready for deployment. Her dark hair was styled in elaborate arrangements that took hours to perfect. Her violet eyes, that unusual shade that made men stumble over their words, were practiced at looking simultaneously innocent and knowing. Her figure was laced into fashionable proportions. Her conversation was rehearsed to sound spontaneous. Her mother had one mission: find a wealthy husband before Florence's youth became a memory, before those violet eyes lost their sparkle, before her value on the marriage market began its inevitable decline. The hunt was on, and in 1880, during a transatlantic crossing that would change everything, they found their prey. Moral question for viewers: when society teaches young women that marriage is their only path to security, can we blame them for treating it as a transaction rather than a romance? Is Florence a victim of her upbringing, or did she always have a choice? Then came the fateful voyage of March 1880. The SS Baltic was one of the great ocean liners of its era, a floating palace of polished brass and crystal chandeliers, carrying the wealthy and the ambitious across the Atlantic in comfort that ordinary people could barely imagine. First-class passengers dined on 7-course meals, danced in ballrooms that rivaled any on land, and conducted business deals and romantic intrigues with equal enthusiasm. Florence and her mother boarded in New York, bound for Liverpool. The Baroness had arranged their passage carefully, selecting a voyage known to attract wealthy businessmen returning to England after conducting affairs in America. Among the passengers was James Maybrick. He was 42 years old, a successful cotton broker whose business dealings stretched from Liverpool to the American South. He had offices in both cities, investments in shipping companies, and a reputation for shrewd dealing that had made him wealthy by the standards of Victorian commerce. He also had something that made him irresistible to ambitious mothers. He was still unmarried. At 42, with money and no wife. In the social calculations of the era, this was either a warning sign or an opportunity. Caroline chose to see it as opportunity. James was immediately captivated by Florence. She was 18, beautiful, and possessed of that particular kind of youthful energy that made aging bachelors feel young again. When she laughed at his jokes, he felt witty. When she listened to his opinions, he felt wise. When she gazed at him with those violet eyes, he felt like the most important man on the ship. Their shipboard romance progressed with the speed of a transatlantic crossing, urgent, compressed, conducted in the artificial intimacy of people who have nowhere else to go. By the time the Baltic docked in Liverpool, James had proposed marriage. The Baroness von Roques could hardly believe her luck. James Maybrick was exactly the kind of catch she had been hunting, wealthy enough to provide security, established enough to provide respectability, and old enough that Florence might reasonably expect to be a comfortable widow before she turned 40. There was just one problem, one that Florence wouldn't discover until after the wedding, when the vows had been spoken and the papers signed, and the trap had closed around her. James Maybrick had secrets. He kept them in his medicine cabinet, in his leather satchel, in the pockets of his coat. Small bottles, paper packets, white powders that he stirred into his coffee and swallowed with his breakfast. James Maybrick was not merely a wealthy cotton broker with a young bride. He was a man who was slowly, deliberately poisoning himself. And one of those poisons would prove deadly, though not in the way anyone expected. The wedding took place on July 27, 1881, at St. James's Church in Piccadilly, London, one of the most fashionable venues in England, where the wealthy came to consecrate their alliances and display their status. Florence wore white, as convention demanded. She was 19 years old. Her new husband was 43. At first, the marriage seemed everything Caroline had hoped for. James installed his young bride in Battlecrease House, a grand 17-room mansion in the Liverpool suburb of Aigburth. The house sat behind iron gates on manicured grounds, with servants' quarters in the back and receiving rooms in the front designed to impress visitors with the Maybricks' prosperity. Florence had horses, carriages, a full staff of servants, and access to the highest levels of Liverpool society. She bore 2 children, James Chandler in 1882 and Gladys Evelyn in 1886. She entertained guests with grace and hosted parties that were mentioned in the social columns. By every external measure, she had achieved exactly what her mother had trained her to achieve. But this wasn't a love match transformed by circumstance. This was a business arrangement that Florence began to recognize as something far more disturbing than mere coldness. James Maybrick was not merely older than his wife. He was not merely set in his ways, resistant to change, dismissive of her opinions. He was a hypochondriac of extraordinary proportions, a man obsessed with his own health, convinced that he was perpetually on the verge of some catastrophic illness that only constant medication could prevent. His medicine cabinet was a toxicologist's nightmare. Arsenic, strychnine, phosphorus, mercury compounds, patent medicines with ingredients that no modern pharmacist would touch. He took them all in doses that would have killed a man unfamiliar with their effects. He took arsenic in his coffee every morning, claiming it improved his complexion and gave him energy. He took strychnine to stimulate his nerves. He swallowed pills and powders that even his doctors couldn't identify. In the 1880s, this was not as unusual as it sounds today. Arsenic was commonly sold as a tonic, advertised to improve vitality, enhance sexual performance, and create that fashionable pallor that Victorian society prized. Men and women alike consumed it in small doses, building up tolerance until they required ever larger quantities to achieve the same effect. But James's consumption went far beyond fashion or habit. He was an addict, and like all addicts, he was destroying himself while convinced he was preserving himself. Florence watched her husband swallow poison every morning. She saw him suffer the effects, The trembling hands, the digestive troubles, the mood swings that oscillated between manic energy and crushing depression. She endured his complaints, his demands, his constant focus on his own ailments to the exclusion of her needs. And she began to see a path forward, though not the one her husband intended. If James was poisoning himself, perhaps she wouldn't need to wait for nature to take its course. Perhaps she could simply help things along. Or perhaps she simply wanted to be free, and the arsenic that saturated their household provided an opportunity that a less desperate woman would never have considered. The evidence would never conclusively prove which interpretation was correct, but the path to tragedy was now clearly marked. It was in the drawing rooms of Battlecrease House that Florence first encountered Alfred Brierly, and everything changed. Brierly was a cotton broker like James, a business associate who visited regularly to discuss trade conditions and market opportunities. But unlike James, Alfred was closer to Florence's own age. Unlike James, he was handsome, attentive, and apparently fascinated by everything she had to say. Unlike James, he looked at her as though she were a woman worth pursuing, not a trophy already won and filed away. The affair began in 1887. Perhaps it was inevitable. Perhaps Florence had simply reached the limit of what she could endure. The lonely nights, the medicine cabinet breakfasts, the husband who cared more about his own health than about her happiness. By 1889, Florence and Alfred were meeting in London hotels under assumed names, conducting a relationship that was as reckless as it was inevitable. They registered as Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Maybrick, a cruel joke that used her husband's own family name to cover their betrayal. They exchanged letters filled with endearments and longing, written in handwriting that prosecutors would later analyze for evidence of murderous intent. Florence later admitted to the affair, though she insisted it remained purely emotional until the very end. Few believed her, and in the context of what came next, the distinction hardly mattered. James Maybrick was worth an estimated £50,000 at his death, roughly $5 million in today's currency. His businesses generated substantial ongoing income. His life insurance policies, accumulated over years of hypochondriac paranoia, named Florence as the primary beneficiary. The financial calculation was simple. If James died, Florence would be wealthy and free. If James lived, she would remain trapped in a marriage to a man she had grown to despise, watching him swallow arsenic every morning while she fantasized about what might happen if he swallowed just a little more. But there was a complication that made patience impossible. James had discovered the affair. March 1889, after the Grand National Horse Race at Aintree, one of the great social events of the Liverpool calendar, where the wealthy gathered to bet on horses and judge each other's clothing, James confronted Florence publicly. In front of friends, in front of servants, in front of society gossips who would dine out on the story for months, he struck her across the face and blackened her eye. The servants saw everything. They saw Florence's humiliation. They saw James's rage. They saw the marriage that had seemed so enviable from the outside revealed as something violent and ugly. The neighbors whispered, the gossip spread, and Florence Maybrick became a woman with a problem that had no acceptable solution. She had a lover, she had a violent husband. She had access to the one substance that James consumed in dangerous quantities anyway. And she had, if James chose to exercise it, the threat of divorce hanging over her, a social death sentence that would leave her penniless, disgraced, and permanently excluded from the world she had been raised to inhabit. The stage was set for tragedy. The only question was who would become the victim. Oral question for viewers. When a husband is violent and a wife is trapped, does society's refusal to offer her any legitimate escape make it complicit in whatever she does next? Where does victimhood end and responsibility begin? But what no one knew, what wouldn't emerge until the trial made it impossible to ignore, was that Florence Maybrick had been purchasing arsenic in the weeks before her husband's death. The purchases were not subtle. They were not hidden. They were almost brazen in their transparency, as though Florence either didn't understand the danger or didn't care. On April 24, 1889, she visited a chemist's shop in Liverpool and bought flypapers, strips of paper soaked in arsenic, commonly used to poison household pests. The purchase was recorded in the chemist's ledger, her name inscribed in ink that would later become evidence. She bought more flypapers on April 29th. And servants at Battlecrease House later testified, under oath, with Florence sitting in the defendant's dock, that they had seen their mistress soaking these papers in water, extracting the arsenic into a solution that she collected in small containers. When asked about her purchases, Florence offered an explanation that would echo through the trial and haunt her for the rest of her life. She claimed she needed the arsenic for her complexion. It sounds absurd today. It sounds like a lie so transparent that only a desperate woman would offer it. But Victorian women did, in fact, use diluted arsenic solutions for cosmetic purposes. The poison created a pale, fashionable complexion that society prized. Women applied it to their skin, sometimes swallowed tiny amounts, believing that beauty was worth the risk of death. Florence's explanation was not impossible, but the timing was devastating. On April 27th, just 3 days after her first arsenic purchase, James Maybrick fell violently ill with vomiting and numbness. The symptoms were consistent with arsenic poisoning. They were also consistent with the effects of his own self-medication, his years of chronic arsenic consumption finally catching up with him. He would never fully recover. The illness that began on April 27th would drag on for 2 weeks, with James alternating between improvement and collapse, between hope and despair. And in those 2 weeks, Florence Maybrick was observed doing something that would destroy any chance of an innocent interpretation. On May 9th, a nurse named Alice Grant observed Florence approach the bedside table where James's medicine was kept. Florence picked up a bottle of meat juice, a protein extract prescribed for invalids, meant to nourish patients too weak to eat solid food. She appeared to pour something into the bottle, then replaced it on the table. When Grant examined the bottle later, she found sediment that hadn't been there before. The meat juice was tested by forensic chemists. It contained arsenic. Florence's explanation, that she had added nothing but a harmless powder James had requested, was contradicted by the chemical analysis. The science was clear, even if the motive remained murky. She had tampered with her dying husband's food, and she had been caught. From that moment, Florence was effectively under surveillance. The servants watched her every move with the suspicious eyes of people who have already concluded someone is guilty. Letters were intercepted. Visitors were monitored. The household that had once served Florence now worked to document her destruction. When James Maybrick finally died on May 11, 1889, at the age of 50, there was no question in the minds of those who had witnessed Florence's behavior. They had seen the flypaper purchases. They had seen the solution preparation. They had seen the meat juice tampering. The prosecution would later call it murder. The defense would call it coincidence and misunderstanding. But the servants who lived in Battlecrease House had already reached their verdict. Within hours of James's death, Florence Maybrick was placed under arrest in her own home, confined to her room like a prisoner while police searched the mansion for evidence of poison. They found it everywhere. In her dressing room, in the pantry, in James's study. The house was saturated with arsenic, a testament to years of accumulation. But was it evidence of murder or simply evidence of a hypochondriac's addiction? The trial would attempt to answer that question. It would fail, and Florence Maybrick would pay for that failure with 15 years of her life. What happened next would consume 2 nations in controversy that has never fully subsided. Trial so sensational that it made headlines from Liverpool to New York, filling newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic with daily dispatches that readers devoured like serialized fiction. A verdict so controversial that 100,000 people signed petitions demanding Florence's release, ordinary citizens who had never met her, who would never meet her, but who recognized injustice when they saw it. Evidence so ambiguous that legal scholars still debate her guilt today, over a century later, with access to forensic techniques that Victorian prosecutors could never have imagined. But first, you need to understand exactly what was found in James Maybrick's body, and why the doctors who examined him couldn't agree on what killed him. You need to see the letter Florence wrote to her lover 3 days before James died, the letter that prosecutors called a confession and Florence called an expression of hope during a desperate time. You need to understand why a jury of 12 men, deliberating for just 38 minutes, decided that a woman who admitted to adultery must also be guilty of murder. In just a moment, the trial begins, and with it, the destruction of everything Florence Maybrick had spent her life trying to build. The marriage that had begun as a strategic alliance on a transatlantic liner now revealed itself as something far more toxic than the medicines James Maybrick consumed every morning. The servants at Battlecrease House observed a household in crisis, not the sudden explosion of violence, but the slow decay of 2 people who had never truly known each other, trapped together by vows that offered no exit. James berated Florence constantly for her extravagance, despite giving her an allowance inadequate to maintain the lifestyle he demanded. He expected her to host dinners, to dress fashionably, to present herself as the wife of a wealthy merchant, but he provided resources sufficient only for a merchant's clerk. When she overspent, as she inevitably did, he raged. When she economized, he complained that she was embarrassing him in front of their social equals. Florence complained of his coldness, his hypochondria, his endless obsession with his own ailments at the expense of any attention to hers. She had married a man, not a medicine cabinet. She had expected a husband, not a patient. But James treated every conversation as an opportunity to catalog his symptoms, every dinner as a chance to discuss his digestion, every evening as an occasion for self-medication that left him alternating between manic energy and comatose stupor. And after the incident at Aintree, when James struck Florence in public, marking her face with a bruise that all of Liverpool society witnessed. The pretense of domestic harmony collapsed entirely. They no longer ate meals together. They no longer shared a bedroom consistently. They communicated through servants, leaving messages rather than speaking directly. The 17-room mansion became a battlefield of silence, with each spouse occupying separate territories and emerging only when duty required. But it was Florence's letter to Alfred Brierly that would prove most damaging. A letter that was never meant to be read by anyone except her lover, and that would be read instead by prosecutors, jurors, and eventually by millions of newspaper readers across 2 continents. Written on May 8, 1889, just 3 days before James died, the letter was intercepted by a servant named Alice Yap. Yap claimed she accidentally opened it when the addressed envelope became wet while she was walking with Florence's daughter. She claimed the ink had smeared, requiring her to open the envelope to see who should receive the contents. It was a convenient accident. It was an accident that would send Florence to prison. The letter contained passages that prosecutors would read as proof of murderous intent. "Dearest, he is sick unto death, all depending upon how long his strength holds out. My own darling, I shall miss you so much this weekend." Florence would later claim these words expressed hope that James's illness would end, hope that he would recover, that the crisis would pass, that she could resume her affair without the complication of a dying husband. She insisted the phrase "sick unto death" was a colloquialism, not a prediction. She insisted how long his strength holds out referred to his recovery, not his demise. The jury didn't believe her. The newspapers didn't believe her. The servants who had already concluded she was guilty definitely didn't believe her. But here is the question that the trial never adequately addressed. If Florence Maybrick was planning to murder her husband, why would she write evidence of her intentions in a letter? If she was clever enough to acquire arsenic without being caught, clever enough to administer it over weeks without detection, why would she be foolish enough to document her plans to her lover? Was the letter evidence of murder, or evidence of a woman desperately hoping her problems would resolve themselves without requiring her to take action? The prosecution offered one interpretation. The defense offered another. And the jury, after 38 minutes of deliberation, chose the interpretation that punished adultery as severely as murder. The trap was closing, and Florence Maybrick was running out of room to escape. In the second week of May 1889, Florence Maybrick made a decision that would prove catastrophic for her defense, though whether that decision was murder or merely misguided nursing remains debated to this day. She handled her husband's medicine when she had no medical reason to do so. On May 9th, with James growing weaker by the hour, a professional nurse named Alice Grant was engaged to provide around-the-clock care. Grant was experienced, observant, and, as it would turn out, suspicious by nature. She watched everything that happened in that sick room with the careful attention of someone who expected to testify about it later. What she observed would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Florence approached the bedside table where James's medication was kept. She picked up a bottle of Valentine's meat juice, a protein extract prescribed for invalids, intended to provide nourishment when solid food was impossible. The bottle was half full, the contents clear, the label indicating it had been dispensed by a reputable chemist. Grant watched Florence handle the bottle. She watched Florence appear to pour something into it, or perhaps just shake it, or examine it, or adjust its position. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, and Grant's account would vary slightly each time she repeated it. But the core remained consistent. Florence had touched the meat juice. Florence had done something to the meat juice, and afterward the meat juice contained arsenic. When Grant examined the bottle later that day, she found sediment that hadn't been there before, a white residue that settled at the bottom, visible through the glass. She said nothing to Florence. She said nothing to the other servants. Instead, she preserved the bottle as evidence and waited for authorities to take action. The meat juice was tested by forensic chemists. The results were unambiguous. The solution contained arsenic in quantities that could not be explained by accidental contamination. Florence's explanation, that she had added nothing but a harmless powder James had requested, that he had asked her to put something in his food and she had complied, was contradicted by the chemical analysis. James had not requested poison. The powder she claimed to have added did not contain arsenic. The meat juice tampering was either murder or the most convenient coincidence in criminal history. From that moment, Florence was effectively under surveillance. The servants no longer trusted her. They watched her move through the house with eyes that had already condemned her. They preserved evidence, handkerchiefs, bottles, scraps of paper, that might later prove useful to prosecutors. They kept records of her behavior, noting times and locations and anything that seemed suspicious. When James Maybrick finally died on May 11, 1889, at the age of 50, there was no question in the minds of those who had witnessed Florence's behavior. The meat juice tampering had sealed her fate. The letter to Brierly had revealed her motive. The flypaper purchases had provided the means. Within hours of James's death, before his body was cold, before the funeral arrangements could be made, before Florence could even begin to process the reality of her widowhood, police arrived at Battlecrease House. Florence Maybrick was placed under arrest in her own home. She was confined to her bedroom under guard while investigators searched the mansion room by room, drawer by drawer, bottle by bottle. They found arsenic everywhere. In her dressing room, packets and bottles containing the poison in various forms. In a chocolate box in her wardrobe, arsenic powder mixed with other substances. In James's study, arsenic among his numerous patent medicines. The house was saturated with poison, a testament to years of accumulation, years of James's addiction, years of exposure that made the presence of arsenic at Battlecrease House utterly unsurprising. The prosecutors would argue that the saturation itself was evidence of planning. Florence had access to arsenic everywhere she turned. She could have taken it from any of a dozen sources. She could have administered it gradually, over weeks, in doses small enough to escape detection until it was too late. The arrest was not gentle. The questions were not sympathetic. And Florence Maybrick, 27 years old, mother of 2 young children, found herself treated not as a grieving widow, but as a calculating murderess. The trial would begin in July. Florence had 2 months to prepare her defense, 2 months to find lawyers willing to challenge the prosecution's narrative, 2 months to somehow convince a jury that despite the flypapers, despite the meat juice, despite the letter to Brierly, she had not murdered her husband. 2 months to save her life. It would not be enough. The evidence against Florence Maybrick seemed overwhelming to those who wanted to believe in her guilt. But there were warning signs, clear, documented, undeniable, that investigators and prosecutors chose to ignore. James Maybrick had been poisoning himself for years. This was not speculation. This was not defense attorney manipulation. This was documented fact, testified to by witnesses who had no reason to lie and nothing to gain from their testimony. His own brothers knew of his arsenic habit. Edwin Maybrick, who would become one of Florence's most vocal accusers, had seen James consume arsenic on multiple occasions. He knew his brother took the poison daily. He knew the quantities were dangerous by any normal standard. Yet somehow, in his eagerness to condemn his sister-in-law, he forgot to mention that James's death might be explained by something other than murder. Business associates testified that James had discussed his self-medication openly, even proudly. He boasted of the quantities he consumed, treating his arsenic tolerance as evidence of his robust constitution rather than his deteriorating judgment. One witness claimed James took enough arsenic in a single dose to kill 3 healthy men, a quantity that should have stopped his heart immediately, but instead merely stimulated his nerves. If James Maybrick was a chronic arsenic user, and the evidence overwhelmingly supported this conclusion, then finding arsenic in his body after death proved nothing. His system would naturally contain elevated levels of the poison. His tissues would be saturated with it. His organs would show the cumulative effects of years of exposure. More troubling still, the medical evidence was flatly contradictory. The autopsy, conducted by Dr. Thomas Stevenson, found arsenic in James's stomach and intestines. This was expected, given the prosecution's theory that Florence had administered poison in his food during the final days of his illness. But the concentrations were far lower than would be expected in a fatal poisoning. One expert calculated that James's body contained less than half a grain of arsenic at death. A half grain. The typical fatal dose was 2 to 3 grains, 4 to 6 times what was actually found. For an arsenic-habituated user like James, half a grain should have been practically nothing. He consumed that much with his morning coffee. He took that much as a casual supplement. Half a grain should not have killed him. Other doctors disagreed. They argued that the distribution of arsenic in the body, the pattern of absorption, the timing of administration could all affect how much remained detectable after death. They argued that Florence's guilt could be inferred from circumstance even if the physical evidence was ambiguous. The argument over James Maybrick's cause of death would consume hours of trial testimony. Medical experts for the prosecution claimed arsenic poisoning was obvious. Medical experts for the defense claimed it was impossible to determine any cause of death from the evidence available. The jury would be left to sort through expert opinions that directly and irreconcilably contradicted one another. In a just world, that contradiction would have created reasonable doubt. In a just world, the jury would have acknowledged that they couldn't know what killed James Maybrick, and that uncertainty should favor the accused. But this was not a just world. This was Victorian England, where a woman who admitted to adultery had already committed one unforgivable crime. The jury was not being asked to determine whether Florence Maybrick killed her husband. They were being asked to punish her for betraying him. And that question they had already answered in their hearts before the trial even began. In the days following James's death, The search of Battlecrease House became a prosecution's treasure hunt. Every drawer opened, every cabinet searched, every container tested for traces of the poison that saturated the entire residence. Police found arsenic everywhere. This should not have surprised anyone. James Maybrick had accumulated a pharmacy's worth of medicines over decades of hypochondriac consumption. The house was a museum of Victorian quackery, a testament to one man's obsessive pursuit of health through chemistry. In Florence's dressing room, investigators found packets and bottles containing arsenic in various forms. Some were clearly labeled. Others were mixed with cosmetic preparations. All of them, prosecutors would argue, demonstrated Florence's access to the murder weapon. In a chocolate box hidden in her wardrobe, they found arsenic powder mixed with other substances. Florence claimed the chocolates had been there for years, that the arsenic was James's, that she had no idea how it had gotten into her private effects. No one believed her. In James's study, they found arsenic among his numerous patent medicines. This was entirely consistent with the defense theory that James had killed himself through chronic self-medication, but prosecutors reframed it as evidence that Florence knew where to find poison when she needed it. Most damaging was what investigators found in Florence's personal effects: a handkerchief soaked in arsenic solution, tucked into her dresser with apparent carelessness. A bottle labeled poison containing arsenic mixed with other substances, sitting openly on her dressing table. If Florence Maybrick was a calculating murderess, she was spectacularly incompetent at hiding evidence. If she was innocent, the arsenic that investigators found everywhere was simply the residue of a household where poison was as common as salt. Florence's explanations grew increasingly desperate. Claimed the arsenic in her dressing room was for cosmetic use, a defense that was technically plausible but emotionally unconvincing. She claimed the arsenic in the chocolate box was a mistake, a confusion of containers, a household accident that looked sinister only in retrospect. She claimed the meat juice tampering was James's own request, that he had asked her to add a powder to make it more palatable, and she had simply complied with a dying man's wishes. None of it mattered. By the time Florence Maybrick appeared in the Liverpool courtroom on July 31, 1889, she was already the most despised woman in England. The newspapers had convicted her. The public had convicted her. The servants who would testify against her had convicted her months before the first witness was sworn. She was not merely accused of murder. She was accused of being the wrong kind of woman, a beautiful American adulteress who had allegedly poisoned her wealthy English husband for money and for love. She represented everything Victorian society feared about female sexuality, female ambition, female autonomy. The trial was scheduled to last 1 week. The outcome was never truly in doubt. But the proceedings would expose something more troubling than one woman's guilt or innocence. They would reveal a legal system so eager to punish women who violated social norms that it would ignore evidence, dismiss reasonable doubt, and send a possibly innocent woman to prison for 15 years. The trial of Florence Maybrick was not about justice. It was about control, and Florence Maybrick was about to learn what happened to women who refused to be controlled. What happened in that Liverpool courtroom would generate outrage on 2 continents, outrage that has never fully subsided, even after more than a century. Verdict so questionable that it triggered the largest petition campaign in British history, with 500,000 ordinary citizens demanding that a convicted murderess be set free. A judge's behavior so biased that legal experts condemned it for decades, using the Maybrick trial as a textbook example of how prejudice corrupts proceedings. But the trial record reveals something far more troubling than prosecutorial overreach or judicial misconduct. In just a moment, you'll see exactly what the jury was told about Florence's affair, not as context, but as evidence. You'll hear the judge's instructions, which explicitly told 12 men that a woman who committed adultery had demonstrated a moral character consistent with murder. You'll understand why 38 minutes of deliberation was enough to decide that a woman should hang. And you'll see how close Florence Maybrick came to dying. 3 days from execution before public pressure forced a commutation that satisfied no one and condemned her to 15 years of living death. The trial of Florence Maybrick opened on July 31, 1889, before Justice James Fitzjames Stephen in the Liverpool Summer Assizes. And from the first hour, it became clear that Florence was fighting not merely for her freedom, but against the entire weight of Victorian moral judgment. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled. Standing room was sold to those wealthy enough to pay for the privilege of watching a woman fight for her life. The press gallery overflowed with reporters from London, from New York, from Paris and Berlin, all of them transmitting daily dispatches to readers who followed the trial with the intensity of addicts awaiting their next dose. Justice Stephen presided with the authority of a man who had already reached his conclusions. He was 60 years old, a distinguished legal scholar, the author of influential treatises on criminal law. He was also, as would become apparent within years of the trial, suffering from mental deterioration that would eventually render him legally insane. But in July 1889, no one questioned his fitness. No one challenged his instructions. No one suggested that a judge who would die in an asylum might not be the appropriate arbiter of another person's sanity. The prosecution's case rested on 3 pillars, each of which seemed solid from a distance, but crumbled under serious examination. First, they argued that Florence had motive. The affair with Brierly proved she no longer loved her husband. The insurance policies proved she would benefit from his death. The violent confrontation at Aintree proved she feared exposure and disgrace. Together, these circumstances created a portrait of a woman desperate enough to kill. Second, they argued that Florence had means. The flypaper purchases demonstrated her access to arsenic. The arsenic found throughout the house demonstrated her familiarity with the poison. The meat juice tampering demonstrated her willingness to administer it secretly. Third, they argued that Florence had opportunity. She was present throughout James's final illness. She had access to his food and medicine. She was the only person who stood to gain from his death who also had the ability to accomplish it. But it was the defense's response that should have created reasonable doubt that the jury was never permitted to feel. James Maybrick was a known arsenic addict. The prosecution acknowledged this. The defense emphasized it. Multiple witnesses testified that James consumed arsenic daily in quantities that should have killed him years ago. His body had developed tolerance. His system was saturated with the poison. If James died of arsenic poisoning, he might have poisoned himself. His death could have been the natural culmination of years of self-medication, the final collapse of organs that had been stressed beyond endurance. The prosecution offered no explanation for why this interpretation was wrong, only the assertion that it must be wrong because Florence was guilty. The quantities found in James's body were inconsistent with fatal poisoning. Less than half a grain, a fraction of a lethal dose. The prosecution's own experts admitted they could not explain this discrepancy. They speculated that the arsenic had been absorbed, distributed, eliminated before death. But speculation is not proof, and the physical evidence did not support their theory. Multiple doctors testified that they could not determine arsenic as the definitive cause of death. The autopsy had found arsenic, yes, but it had also found inflammation, damage, deterioration consistent with chronic disease, chronic poisoning, chronic abuse of a body that had never been healthy. James Maybrick might have died of arsenic. He might have died of heart failure. He might have died of any number of causes that the medicine of 1889 could not accurately diagnose. And Florence herself took the stand. She wept as she admitted the affair, the confession that Victorian society would never forgive. She acknowledged that she had conducted a relationship with Alfred Brierly, that she had met him in hotels, that she had written him letters expressing affection that properly belonged only to her husband. But she denied, absolutely, completely, desperately, that she had murdered James. She explained the flypaper purchases. Arsenic cosmetics were a common Victorian practice. Women did apply diluted arsenic solutions to their skin. Women did believe it improved their complexions. Florence was not unique in seeking beauty through chemistry. She was merely unfortunate in the timing of her purchases. She explained the meat juice tampering. James had asked her to add a powder to make it more palatable. He was dying. He was in pain. He had spent decades self-medicating with substances far more dangerous than anything Florence might have added. She was simply complying with a dying man's request. She explained the letter to Brierly. "He is sick unto death" was a common phrase, an expression of worry, not a prediction of murder. How long his strength holds out referred to his recovery, not his demise. She was a woman in love with another man, trapped in a marriage to a husband who was dying, and she was expressing the complex emotions that anyone in her situation would feel. The jury deliberated for just 38 minutes. 38 minutes to consider weeks of testimony, hundreds of pages of evidence, expert opinions that contradicted each other absolutely. 38 minutes to determine whether a woman should live or die. They returned with a verdict of guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered, those who had wanted Florence punished for her adultery and finally saw their wishes granted. Others wept, those who had recognized the inadequacy of the evidence and feared what the verdict meant for justice. Florence Maybrick stood motionless. She had wept during her testimony. She had trembled during closing arguments. But at the moment of her conviction, she showed no emotion at all, as though the verdict confirmed something she had always known, something she had been waiting for since the day she married James Maybrick. Justice Stephen pronounced sentence with visible satisfaction. "You have been convicted of the murder of your husband," he intoned, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "But the evidence has also established that you were guilty of the fearful and wicked crime of adultery, a crime that, in the eyes of this court and of Almighty God, is scarcely less serious than the crime for which you stand convicted." He sentenced her to death by hanging. He recommended her soul to the attention of a higher power. He dismissed her from his courtroom with the contempt of a man who had just accomplished something righteous. Florence Maybrick was led away to the condemned cell. She was 27 years old. She was the mother of 2 young children, and she had been convicted not merely of murder, but of being a woman who had sought happiness outside the boundaries society permitted. The execution was scheduled for August 26, 1889. Florence would spend her remaining days in a stone cell, writing letters that were never delivered, receiving visits from lawyers who could offer no hope, waiting for the morning when guards would come to lead her to the gallows. But the verdict was controversial from the moment it was announced. Within hours, newspapers began questioning the evidence. The New York Times published an editorial condemning the trial as a miscarriage of justice, noting that Florence had been convicted of adultery and punished with death for murder. Legal scholars dissected the transcript and found Justice Stevens' instructions to the jury had been overtly prejudicial, emphasizing the affair far beyond its evidentiary relevance. Within days, petitions demanding clemency flooded the Home Office. 500,000 signatures eventually appeared, the largest clemency campaign in British history to that date. Ordinary citizens who had never met Florence Maybrick, who would never meet her, recognized something wrong in the way she had been tried and convicted. American newspapers were particularly outraged. Florence was an American citizen, and her treatment by English courts was seen as an insult to the nation. Diplomatic pressure was applied. The American ambassador made inquiries. The British government found itself in the uncomfortable position of defending a verdict that even its own officials questioned. Queen Victoria herself was reportedly disturbed by the proceedings. She communicated her concerns through private channels, never publicly challenging the judiciary, but making clear that she found the verdict troubling. 3 days before Florence's scheduled execution, the Home Secretary intervened. Henry Matthews reviewed the case extensively. He consulted with medical experts who had not testified at trial. He examined the evidence with fresh eyes, unburdened by the pressure of a courtroom or the expectations of a jury. His conclusion was devastating for the prosecution. The evidence was insufficient to support a murder conviction. The quantities of arsenic found in James's body were consistent with chronic self-administration, not acute poisoning. The medical testimony was contradictory. The cause of death could not be determined with certainty. Florence Maybrick might be guilty, she might be innocent, but the evidence did not prove her guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Yet Matthews declined to pardon her outright. Instead, he commuted her sentence from death to life imprisonment. Florence would not hang, but she would not go free. She would serve her time in prison, punished for something the government acknowledged might not have occurred. The decision satisfied no one. Those who believed Florence innocent were outraged that she would remain imprisoned. Those who believed her guilty were outraged that she would not hang. And Florence herself, who had prepared for death and found instead an endless limbo of incarceration, would spend the next 15 years wondering whether the commutation was mercy or simply a slower form of execution. She entered Woking Prison in August 1889. She was 27 years old. She would not breathe free air again until 1904. Her children would be taken from her. Her mother would die without reconciliation. Her youth would wither in prison cells, and the question of her guilt would follow her to the grave and beyond. Unanswered, unanswerable, the perfect ambiguity of a case that revealed more about Victorian society than about one woman's possible crime. Did Florence Maybrick kill her husband? Or was she convicted of adultery and punished with imprisonment for murder? The evidence, over a century later, still refuses to answer. And perhaps that refusal is the verdict's true legacy, a reminder that justice is not always about truth, that courts are not always about evidence, and that sometimes the worst crime a woman can commit is simply wanting to be free. The response to Florence Maybrick's conviction was immediate, unprecedented, and ultimately futile. Within weeks of the verdict, a tide of outrage swept across 2 continents, the kind of spontaneous public fury that governments learn to fear and rarely understand. Ordinary people who had never attended a courtroom, who would never meet Florence Maybrick, who had no personal stake in her fate, recognized something fundamentally wrong in what had been done to her. Nearly 500,000 signatures appeared on petitions demanding her release. 500,000. In an era before social media, before organized advocacy campaigns, before the machinery of public opinion had been professionalized. 500,000 people took pen in hand, signed their names to documents, and sent them to the Home Office with a message that could not be misunderstood. This woman should not be in prison. It was the largest clemency campaign in British history to that date, larger than any campaign for political reform, larger than any protest against war or taxation. 500,000 people, united by nothing except their conviction that Florence Maybrick had been wronged. American newspapers published editorials condemning the trial as a travesty of justice. The New York Times, not known for sensationalism or emotional appeals, declared flatly that Florence had been convicted of adultery, not murder. That English justice had failed. That a woman was being punished not for what she had done, but for what she was. Language was extraordinary. Newspapers that normally treated foreign legal proceedings with polite deference openly accused the British courts of prejudice, incompetence, and moral cowardice. Diplomatic cables flew between Washington and London. The American ambassador made formal inquiries. The British government found itself defending a verdict that even its own officials privately questioned. Legal scholars dissected the trial transcript with the precision of surgeons examining a diseased organ. What they found was damning. Justice Stevens' instructions to the jury had been overtly prejudicial. He had emphasized Florence's affair far beyond its evidentiary relevance, suggesting to 12 men that a woman who betrayed her husband in one way was certainly capable of betraying him in another. He had dismissed the medical evidence that supported the defense, characterizing expert testimony as confusion rather than reasonable doubt. He had, in effect, told the jury that Florence Maybrick was guilty, and they had simply followed his instructions. His mental fitness was later questioned with devastating effect. Within 3 years of the Maybrick trial, Justice Stephen would be declared legally insane. He would be committed to an asylum, where he would die in 1894, his mind having deteriorated beyond repair. The judge who had sentenced Florence Maybrick to death was himself losing the capacity for rational judgment even as he presided over her fate. Did his declining mental state affect the trial? Did his instructions reflect legal reasoning or the confused morality of a deteriorating mind? These questions were asked too late to help Florence. By the time Justice Stevens' condition became undeniable, she had already spent years in prison, and the legal system had no mechanism for revisiting verdicts tainted by judicial incompetence. Home Secretary Henry Matthews reviewed the case extensively. He was a cautious man, a political creature who understood that his decisions would be scrutinized by press, public, and parliament. He consulted with medical experts who had not testified at trial. He examined the physical evidence with fresh eyes. He considered the diplomatic implications of maintaining a possibly unjust conviction against an American citizen. His conclusion was clear, if carefully worded. The evidence was insufficient to support a murder conviction with certainty. The arsenic in James's body could be explained by chronic self-administration. The medical testimony was contradictory. The cause of death remained genuinely uncertain. Yet Matthews declined to pardon Florence outright. The political calculus was too dangerous. Pardoning a convicted murderess would outrage those who believed in her guilt. It would suggest that the British legal system made mistakes, an admission no government wants to make. It would create a precedent that every convicted criminal might exploit. So Matthews chose the coward's path. He commuted the sentence. Florence would not hang, but she would not go free. She would serve life imprisonment for a crime the government acknowledged might not have occurred. The decision satisfied no one. It was designed to satisfy no one. It was designed to make the problem go away, to remove Florence from the headlines without requiring anyone to admit that injustice had been done. Florence entered Woking Prison in August 1889. The gates closed behind her, and the woman who had once been the most talked-about defendant in the British Empire began the slow process of being forgotten. There was no accountability for those who destroyed Florence Maybrick's life. None whatsoever. The machinery of justice that had ground her down continued operating without examination, without reform, without consequence for those who had wielded it against her. Justice Stephen retired from the bench in 1891, his mental faculties deteriorating with a speed that suggested they had been failing for years before anyone noticed. He was committed to an asylum shortly thereafter, diagnosed with conditions that modern medicine might classify as dementia or perhaps the late stages of syphilis, diseases that affect judgment, that distort perception, that make a man certain of things that aren't true. Died in 1894, leaving behind a judicial legacy permanently stained by the Maybrick verdict. Legal scholars would cite his instructions to the jury for generations as an example of how prejudice corrupts proceedings. Law students would study the transcript as a case study in everything that can go wrong when a judge forgets that his role is to ensure fairness, not to secure convictions. Yet no formal inquiry ever examined whether his impaired judgment had influenced the trial. No review board questioned whether his instructions were legally sound. No mechanism existed, or was created, to revisit verdicts rendered by judges who subsequently proved mentally incompetent. Florence Maybrick remained in prison, sentenced by a madman, with no recourse and no appeal. Servants who testified against Florence, whose observations had been shaped by their discovery of her affair, faced no scrutiny for potential bias. Alice Yap, who had accidentally opened Florence's letter to Brierly, was praised for her vigilance. The convenient accident that had exposed the affair was treated as providence rather than malice. No one asked whether a servant might have reasons to destroy her mistress. jealousy, resentment, the simple pleasure of watching the mighty fall. Prosecution team received no criticism for presenting a case built on circumstantial evidence and moral condemnation. The forensic experts who had testified that arsenic was definitely the cause of death, despite physical evidence that suggested otherwise, maintained their professional reputations without challenge. Everyone who had contributed to Florence's conviction walked away unscathed. And James Maybrick himself escaped judgment entirely. His arsenic addiction, documented by multiple witnesses, was treated as irrelevant to the question of his death. His violence toward Florence, the public assault at Aintree that had blackened her eye, was mentioned in passing but never examined for what it revealed about their marriage. His 23-year age advantage when he married a teenage girl, his emotional coldness, his obsessive self-medication that created the very environment in which his death occurred, none of this was treated as relevant. James Maybrick was the victim. That was the narrative, and no evidence would be allowed to complicate it. Florence served her time in silence. Prison regulations forbade her from speaking publicly about her case. She could not write letters to newspapers. She could not give interviews to journalists. She could not tell her side of the story while the world that had convicted her moved on without her. Children were taken from her. James Chandler and Gladys Evelyn were raised by relatives who believed their mother was a murderer. They were taught to think of her as a monster, a woman who had killed their father for money and lust. The letters Florence wrote to them from prison were not delivered. The visits she requested were not granted. By the time she was finally released, her children were adults who had spent their formative years learning to hate her. Mother, the Baroness von Roques, died without reconciliation. The woman who had trained Florence for marriage, who had polished her into a weapon for capturing wealthy husbands, who had celebrated her daughter's alliance with James Maybrick. That woman never acknowledged responsibility for the path she had set Florence upon. She died maintaining the social position that was always her primary concern, leaving Florence to rot in prison without the support that might have shortened her sentence. Florence was finally released in 1904. At the age of 42, she was a stranger to her own country, an American citizen who had not set foot in America for over 2 decades, a convicted murderess whose conviction had never been overturned, a mother whose children wanted nothing to do with her, a woman who had entered prison young and emerged middle-aged, with nothing but her notoriety and the clothes on her back. The world had forgotten Florence Maybrick, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to make it remember, or perhaps trying to forget herself. Oral question for viewers. When the justice system fails so completely, when a judge is mentally impaired, when evidence is ignored, when a verdict is driven by moral condemnation rather than proof, does society bear responsibility for what happens to the convicted? Is Florence Maybrick suffering the fault of individuals or of a system designed to punish women who violated social norms? Florence Maybrick returned to America in 1904, a ghost haunting the land of her birth. She was 42 years old. Her dark hair, once her glory, had grayed in prison. The violet eyes that had captivated James Maybrick on a transatlantic crossing a quarter-century earlier now reflected nothing but exhaustion and weariness. She walked with the careful posture of someone who had learned to make herself small, to avoid attention, to expect nothing good from strangers. She settled eventually in a small cottage in South Kent, Connecticut, a rural community far from the social world she had been trained to navigate, far from the drawing rooms and ballrooms where she had once sparkled. The cottage was modest. The neighbors knew her only as Mrs. Chandler, a quiet widow who kept to herself and rarely entertained visitors. She never remarried. What man would have her? A convicted murderess, released but never pardoned, her name forever associated with arsenic and adultery. The stigma followed her like a shadow. Potential suitors, if any existed, would have discovered her history with minimal inquiry. The name Florence Maybrick might have faded from headlines, but it had not disappeared from memory. She never reconciled with her children. James Chandler and Gladys Evelyn had been raised to believe their mother killed their father. They had grown up without her, had formed their characters without her influence, had learned to see her imprisonment not as injustice but as appropriate punishment. When Florence reached out to them after her release, tentative letters, requests for meetings, attempts to rebuild what had been destroyed, they rebuffed her. The rejection must have been devastating. To spend 15 years in prison, sustained perhaps by the hope of eventual reunion with her children, only to discover that they had become strangers who wanted nothing from her. To realize that the prosecution's narrative had won completely, that even her own flesh and blood believed she was a monster. She wrote a memoir, published in 1905, protesting her innocence and detailing the circumstances of her trial. The book was called My 15 Lost Years, and it laid out her version of events with the precision of someone who had spent a decade and a half replaying every moment, every decision, every piece of evidence that had condemned her. The memoir generated some attention but little sympathy. The public that had once signed petitions demanding her release had moved on to other outrages, other causes, other women in trouble. Florence Maybrick was old news. Her suffering was no longer fashionable. The book sold poorly, earning her barely enough to maintain her modest existence. Final years were spent in obscurity. She lived alone. She received few visitors. She maintained correspondence with a handful of people who remembered her case or took interest in her continued protests of innocence. But mostly, she was forgotten, a footnote in legal history, a name that occasionally appeared in discussions of wrongful convictions, a cautionary tale whose moral depended entirely on whether you believed her guilty. Florence Maybrick died on October 23, 1941, at the age of 79. She died in her cottage in South Kent, alone except for the people paid to care for her. She died still technically convicted of a murder that modern forensic science suggests she probably did not commit. She was buried in an unmarked grave. A woman who had once been the most talked-about prisoner in the British Empire, whose case had generated 500,000 petition signatures, whose trial had strained diplomatic relations between two nations, whose name had appeared in headlines from Liverpool to New York to Paris, died without a stone to mark her resting place. Years later, admirers would erect a marker. Florence Maybrick would finally have her name inscribed somewhere permanent. But the delay spoke volumes about how thoroughly she had been erased, how completely the world had moved on from the woman it had once condemned with such passionate certainty. The question of her guilt remains officially unresolved. The conviction was never overturned. The case was never officially reopened. Florence Maybrick died a convicted murderess, regardless of what the evidence actually suggested. For those who study her case carefully, who examine the trial transcript and the medical evidence and the judge's deteriorating mental state, a different verdict emerges. Florence Maybrick's greatest crime was not murder. It was being a woman who sought love outside a marriage to a man who struck her in public, poisoned himself in private, and left her trapped in a life she never chose. The years that followed Florence's death brought unexpected attention and deepened the mystery surrounding her case in ways that no one could have anticipated. 1992, over a century after James Maybrick's death, a diary surfaced that would reignite the controversy with explosive force. The diary was allegedly written by James Maybrick himself. Its pages, filled with cramped Victorian handwriting, contained confessions that went far beyond arsenic addiction or marital cruelty. The author claimed to be Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper, the most infamous serial killer in British history. The phantom who had terrorized Whitechapel in 1888, murdering at least 5 women with surgical precision, taunting police with letters that were never definitively authenticated, disappearing without ever being identified or captured. According to the diary, James Maybrick had committed those murders. He had stalked the streets of London while traveling on business. He had killed prostitutes in a rage fueled by his wife's infidelity, or so the diary claimed. The murders were revenge, displaced violence, the explosion of a man who could not strike at the woman who betrayed him, and so struck at women who reminded him of her. The diary's authenticity was immediately contested. Experts examined the paper, the ink, the handwriting, the historical details. Some declared it genuine, a century-old document that had somehow survived and finally come to light. Others declared it an elaborate hoax, a forgery created by someone with knowledge of the Maybrick case and the Ripper murders, designed to generate publicity and profit. The debate continues to this day. No definitive conclusion has ever been reached. But the controversy brought renewed attention to the Maybrick case, prompting fresh examination of evidence that had been gathering dust in archives for 100 years. Modern forensic analysis of the trial evidence has raised further doubts about the original verdict. Scientists examining the documented arsenic levels in James's body have concluded that they were almost certainly consistent with chronic self-administration, not acute poisoning. The quantities found were far too low to have caused death in someone with James's tolerance, built up over years of daily consumption. The medical testimony that convicted Florence was contradictory and inconclusive by the standards of 1889. By modern standards, it would be laughed out of court. No contemporary forensic expert would testify with certainty that arsenic caused James Maybrick's death. The evidence simply doesn't support that conclusion. The judge's instructions to the jury have been analyzed by legal scholars and found to be demonstrably biased. Justice Stephen told 12 men that adultery indicated a murderous disposition, a statement with no legal foundation, no evidentiary support, and no place in a courtroom. He effectively instructed the jury to convict, and they followed his instructions. Florence Maybrick may well have been innocent, a victim not of justice, but of Victorian morality that could not forgive a woman for seeking love outside an unhappy marriage. A scapegoat for anxieties about female sexuality, female ambition, female autonomy. A sacrifice to the principle that women who violated social norms must be punished, regardless of whether they had committed any actual crime. Or she may have been guilty, a woman who saw arsenic as the solution to a problem that divorce could not solve, a calculating poisoner who exploited her husband's addiction to disguise a murder. A killer who escaped execution through luck and public sympathy, serving 15 years for a crime that deserved hanging. The truth, like Florence herself, remains buried. And perhaps that ambiguity is her most lasting legacy, a reminder that certainty is often an illusion, that verdicts are not the same as truth, and that the question of guilt or innocence may never be answered to everyone's satisfaction. Florence Maybrick's story raises questions that have no comfortable answers, questions that we prefer not to ask because the answers implicate us all. Was she a victim of circumstance? A young woman trained from childhood to see marriage as her only path to security, trapped in a union with an older, violent, self-medicating man who offered her no affection and no escape. Did she see arsenic as her only exit from a prison that looked like a mansion? Or was she a calculating poisoner? A woman who understood exactly what she was doing when she soaked those flypapers, when she added something to her husband's meat juice, when she wrote to her lover that everything depended on how long James's strength held out. Did she murder him for money and freedom, then cry convincingly enough to generate sympathy she didn't deserve? The evidence supports both interpretations. That ambiguity is precisely the point. In the Gilded Age, marriage was often a transaction. Security exchanged for youth and beauty. Stability exchanged for submission. Neither party particularly concerned about the other's happiness because happiness was not the point. The point was arrangement, alliance, the consolidation of resources, and the production of heirs. When those transactions soured, when the security became a cage, when the submission became unbearable, when the arrangement revealed itself as something close to servitude, the exits were desperately limited. Divorce was scandalous. A divorced woman was ruined, excluded from respectable society, unemployable in any position that required references or reputation. Divorce meant poverty, isolation, the slow death of social existence. Separation was financially ruinous. A woman who left her husband forfeited her claim to his property, his income, his protection. She would be cast out with nothing, dependent on charity or the uncertain kindness of relatives. So, for some women, death became the only door that opened. The husband's death. A death that might look natural, especially in an era when medicine couldn't distinguish between poison and disease with any reliability. A death that would leave the wife wealthy, free, and finally in control of her own destiny. Florence Maybrick may have walked through that door. She may have pushed her husband through it. Or she may have simply watched him walk through on his own, his body finally succumbing to years of self-abuse, while circumstances conspired to make her look guilty. You will never know with certainty. The evidence will never speak clearly enough to silence all doubt. And perhaps that uncertainty is the only honest verdict, an acknowledgement that truth is sometimes beyond reach, that justice is sometimes impossible, that the stories we tell about guilt and innocence are often more about ourselves than about the people we judge. Florence Maybrick opened a door. Whether she pushed her husband through, it remains the question that defines her legacy. And in Fall River, Massachusetts, just 3 years after Florence's conviction, another woman would face the same accusation. Another daughter in an unhappy home, another father with money, another violent death that shocked a community and captivated a nation. But this woman would not go to prison. This woman would walk free despite evidence that still horrifies forensic experts who examine it today. This woman would become a legend, her name immortalized in a children's rhyme that generations have sung without understanding its meaning. Her name was Lizzie Borden, and she had an axe. Oral question for viewers. If Florence Maybrick was innocent, what does her conviction say about a society that was so eager to punish female sexuality that it would imprison a woman for 15 years on ambiguous evidence? And if she was guilty, does that change how we should view the trial? Or does the injustice of the proceedings remain, regardless of the defendant's actual guilt? The pattern emerges early if you know how to look for it. Woman in an unhappy home. A man with money that represents security, freedom, the possibility of a different life. Limited options for escape because society has carefully constructed the walls and sealed the exits. And then, suddenly, violently, with a brutality that shocks everyone who learns of it, the man is dead. Florence Maybrick used arsenic allegedly to end her marriage. She was subtle about it if she did it at all. She worked slowly, incrementally adding a little poison here, a little there, letting time and chemistry do the work. The jury took 38 minutes to convict her. She spent 15 years in prison. But 3 years later, in a small Massachusetts town, where everyone knew everyone and scandals couldn't stay hidden, a woman would take a far more direct approach. No arsenic, no slow poisoning, no pretense of natural illness. Just a hatchet, 19 blows to one victim, 11 blows to another, blood on the walls, bone fragments in the ceiling. Violence so extreme that it seemed impossible any human being could have committed it, let alone a Sunday school teacher with a reputation for charitable works and Christian virtue. Different weapon, different outcome. Same impossible question, what drives a wife or a daughter to murder? Lizzie Borden was about to provide an answer that would echo through American history, an answer that would become a children's rhyme, an answer that would leave a nation divided between those who believed she was guilty and those who refused to accept that a respectable woman could swing a hatchet with such savage fury. The pattern persists, the details change, the underlying truth remains constant. Some homes are prisons, some marriages are traps, and sometimes the only escape is through blood. Lizzie Andrew Borden entered the world on July 19, 1860, in Fall River, Massachusetts, a mill town on the banks of the Taunton River where the American dream was manufactured alongside cotton textiles. The factories belched smoke into skies that were never quite blue, and fortunes were made on the backs of immigrant laborers who arrived from Ireland, Portugal, and French Canada, desperate for work that would slowly destroy their lungs and break their bodies. Fall River was a city of contradictions. Immense wealth existed beside grinding poverty. Mill owners built mansions on the hill while their workers crammed into tenements in the Flint, and everyone, rich and poor alike, knew exactly who belonged where in the rigid hierarchy of New England society. Andrew Jackson Borden knew where he belonged, at the very top. He had clawed his way from undertaker's assistant to bank president through decades of relentless frugality that bordered on pathological miserliness. By 1892, Andrew Borden had amassed a fortune of roughly $300,000, nearly $10 million in today's currency. He sat on the boards of multiple banks. He owned commercial properties throughout the city. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the wealthiest men in Fall River. But Andrew Borden spent money like a man who still feared the poorhouse. The Borden home at 92 2nd Street was a testament to his peculiar relationship with wealth. While Fall River's other wealthy families built sprawling mansions on the fashionable Hill District, homes with indoor plumbing, gas lighting, and rooms for entertaining, Andrew kept his family in a cramped house on an unfashionable street, surrounded by neighbors who could hear every argument through the thin walls. The house had no running water on the upper floors. The family used a privy in the backyard like common laborers. There was no gas lighting, only oil lamps that needed constant filling and cleaning. The rooms were small, the hallways narrow, the atmosphere oppressive even before the August heat turned the house into an oven. Andrew Borden had the money to live anywhere. He chose to live like a man who had nothing, hoarding his wealth while denying his family the comforts that wealth should have provided. His wife Abby understood this about him. She had married him knowing what he was, a man whose first wife had died, leaving him with 2 daughters and a need for someone to manage his household. Abby Durfee Gray was a quiet, heavy-set spinster of 37 when she became the second Mrs. Borden in 1865. She was not beautiful, she was not young, but she was available, respectable, and willing to take on the raising of another woman's children. Lizzie was barely 3 years old when Abby arrived. Her older sister Emma was 12. Neither girl would ever accept their stepmother as family. They called her Mrs. Borden to her face, a cold formality that persisted for nearly 3 decades. Behind her back, they called her worse. They whispered that she was a gold digger despite marrying a man who refused to spend his gold. They complained that she was taking their inheritance, piece by piece, gift by gift. They froze her out of family conversations, excluded her from sisterly confidences, and made clear at every opportunity that she was an intruder in their home. The household at 92 2nd Street was a pressure cooker of resentment, simmering for decades beneath a veneer of Victorian propriety. 3 women and 1 man, sharing a house too small for their hatreds, eating meals in poisonous silence, maintaining appearances while nursing grievances that grew more bitter with every passing year. By the summer of 1892, Lizzie Borden was 32 years old, unmarried, childless, and entirely dependent on a father who showed her no affection and a fortune she might never inherit. She taught Sunday school at the Central Congregational Church. She was active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She was, by all external measures, exactly what a respectable spinster daughter should be. But inside that cramped house on 2nd Street, behind those thin walls, something was building toward an explosion. The pressure cooker was ready to blow. The turning point arrived in the summer of 1892, when Andrew Borden made a decision that would prove fatal, though not in the way he intended. For years, Lizzie and Emma had watched their stepmother's relatives receive gifts and property transfers from their father. Andrew was not generous with his own daughters, but he seemed increasingly willing to share his wealth with Abby's family, outsiders, as far as Lizzie was concerned, who had no claim on the fortune she considered her birthright. The breaking point came in 1887, 5 years before the murders, when Andrew purchased a house for Abby's sister, Sarah Whitehead. The property was worth several $1,000s, a significant sum that Lizzie and Emma saw flowing out of their inheritance and into the pockets of people they despised. The confrontation was explosive. For perhaps the first time in their lives, Lizzie and Emma openly challenged their father. They accused him of favoritism. They demanded to know why Abby's family received gifts while his own daughters received nothing. They questioned whether his will would leave them properly provided for, or whether Abby would inherit everything while they were cast aside. Andrew, startled by their vehemence, attempted to make amends. He transferred a rental property to Lizzie and Emma, a house on 4th Street valued at roughly the same amount as Sarah Whitehead's gift. It was meant to restore balance, to demonstrate that his daughters were not forgotten. But the damage was done. The confrontation had revealed something that could not be unrevealed. The daughters did not trust their father. They did not trust his wife, and they would not accept any arrangement that left their inheritance vulnerable to Abby's influence. From that point forward, family dinners ceased entirely. Lizzie and Emma refused to eat with their father and stepmother, taking meals separately in the kitchen like servants rather than sharing a table with a woman they considered an enemy. They stopped speaking to Abby except when absolutely necessary, and even then their words were cold, clipped, devoid of any warmth. The house became a battleground of silence. Andrew and Abby occupied one sphere, Lizzie and Emma occupied another. They passed each other in hallways without acknowledgement. They lived under the same roof as strangers who happened to share a surname. Then, in the summer of 1892, Andrew Borden made another decision, one that pushed Lizzie beyond whatever limits she had previously maintained. He announced his intention to transfer additional property to Abby. A farm this time. A farm that Lizzie had always assumed would eventually be hers. And more ominously, Andrew began discussing changes to his will, changes that would leave the bulk of his estate to his wife, not his daughters. Lizzie later testified about her reaction to this news, and her words revealed the depth of her fury. She felt her inheritance slipping away, piece by piece, to a woman she could never accept as her mother. 5 weeks later, Andrew and Abby Borden would be dead. Their skulls would be crushed by someone wielding a hatchet with extraordinary fury, not the cold efficiency of a professional killer, but the frenzied violence of someone consumed by rage. Someone who struck again and again and again, long after the victims had stopped moving. Someone who hated them enough to destroy their faces. Oral question for viewers. When a parent consistently favors a step-parent over their own children, when inheritance becomes a weapon of control, when adult children are kept dependent and powerless, does that justify anything? At what point does financial manipulation become a form of abuse that might explain, if not excuse, what came next? In the weeks before the murders, the Borden household descended into something resembling a Cold War, with Lizzie as the only combatant still actively maneuvering. She began laying groundwork, preparing the battlefield, creating a narrative that might prove useful if something were to happen. Lizzie informed her friend Alice Russell of her fears in conversations that would later be repeated in court. She spoke of premonitions, of danger lurking around the family. She claimed that someone was trying to poison them, that their milk tasted strange, that mysterious figures had been seen lurking near the house. She spoke of her father's enemies, businessmen he had wronged, tenants he had evicted, people who might want him dead. She was creating alternative suspects. She was establishing that violence against the Bordens was expected, even inevitable, and that when it came, it would come from outside the family. But her behavior in the days, immediately before the murders, told a different story. On August 3, 1892, the day before Andrew and Abby would die, Lizzie visited Smith's drugstore on South Main Street. She approached the counter and asked to purchase prussic acid. Prussic acid, hydrogen cyanide, one of the most lethal poisons known to science. The druggist, Eli Bentz, refused to sell it without a prescription. Prussic acid was too dangerous, too obviously deadly. Its only legitimate uses were medical or industrial. There was no innocent reason for a Sunday school teacher to need it. Lizzie claimed she needed it to clean a sealskin coat, to kill moths or insects that might damage the fur. Bentz didn't believe her. He turned her away. That same day, both Andrew and Abby Borden fell violently ill. The symptoms came on suddenly: vomiting, stomach cramps, weakness that confined them both to bed. Abby suspected poison immediately. She consulted Dr. Seabury Bowen, the family physician who lived next door, telling him that she feared someone had contaminated their food. Dr. Bowen dismissed her concerns. The milk had been sitting in the basement during an August heat wave. The mutton they had eaten for dinner might have spoiled. There were innocent explanations for food poisoning in summer. Abby was being paranoid. But the timing was extraordinary. Consider the sequence. Lizzie attempts to purchase poison. She is refused. Within hours, her parents fall ill with symptoms consistent with poisoning. Within 24 hours, both parents are dead, not from poison, but from something far more brutal, something that left no doubt about the violence of their end. The question that investigators would never definitively answer, the question that haunts the Borden case to this day: what was Lizzie planning? When poison failed, when the druggist refused to sell her prussic acid, when whatever she had given her parents proved insufficient to kill them, did she reach for an alternative? Did she walk to the basement, select a hatchet from the tools stored there, and decide that if chemistry would not solve her problem, physics would? We will never know with certainty. But the evidence points in one direction, and the direction is toward Lizzie Borden. The morning of August 4th, 1892, began like any other in the Borden household, which is to say, it began in silence and resentment, in the suffocating heat of a house that felt more like a prison than a home. The temperature was already climbing toward 90 degrees by 7 o'clock. The air hung thick and still, without a breath of wind to provide relief. Inside 92 2nd Street, the family moved through their morning routines like actors in a play they had performed too many times, each knowing their part, none speaking more than absolutely necessary. Andrew Borden left home around 9 o'clock for his morning rounds. He was a man of rigid habits, and his routine was well known throughout Fall River. He would visit the banks where he served as director. He would check on his commercial properties. He would collect rents, review accounts, and conduct the business that had made him wealthy. He would return home around 11 for his midday rest. Everyone who knew Andrew Borden knew the schedule, including his daughter. Abby remained in the house, attending to her own routine. She planned to dust the guest bedroom upstairs, a spare room on the 2nd floor where occasional visitors might stay. It was a mundane task, the kind of housekeeping that occupied Victorian women's mornings. Maid Bridget Sullivan, called Maggie by the family, a generic name they used for all their Irish servants, was washing windows outside. It was brutal work in the August heat, and Bridget was suffering. She had been ill the day before, just like Andrew and Abby. Now she was climbing ladders, carrying buckets, scrubbing glass while sweat ran down her face. And Lizzie was home. Her sister Emma was away, visiting friends in Fairhaven, conveniently absent, some would later note, during the window when violence would occur. The stage was set, the players were positioned, and somewhere inside that cramped, overheated house, someone was preparing to commit acts of violence so savage that they would haunt American memory for over a century. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, someone climbed the stairs to the guest bedroom where Abby Borden was making the bed. They came up behind her. She may have heard footsteps, she may have turned, or she may have been struck before she ever knew danger was present. The first blow landed on the back of her skull, driving a hatchet blade deep into bone with such force that fragments would later be found embedded in the ceiling. Abby fell forward, dead or dying before she hit the floor. But the killer wasn't finished. They struck again, and again, and again. 18 more blows after the first, each one crushing bone and destroying tissue, each one driven by a fury that went far beyond what was necessary to kill. By the time the attack ended, the back of Abby Borden's head was unrecognizable, a mass of shattered bone and pulverized brain matter. The violence was not efficient, it was not professional, it was personal. It was the violence of someone who hated their victim, who wanted not merely to kill but to destroy. And then something extraordinary happened. For the next 90 minutes, Abby's body lay on the floor of the guest bedroom, in a spreading pool of blood, while someone went about their morning routine downstairs. Someone cooked breakfast. Someone tidied the kitchen. Someone waited with a corpse cooling overhead for Andrew Borden to return home. At approximately 11 o'clock, Andrew arrived. He was tired from his morning rounds, overheated from the August sun. He lay down on the sofa in the sitting room for his customary nap. He removed his coat. He loosened his collar. He closed his eyes. He never opened them again. The attack on Andrew Borden was even more savage than the attack on his wife. 11 blows to the face and head, delivered while he lay sleeping, unaware that death was standing over him. The hatchet split his skull, crushed his eye socket, destroyed his features so completely that he would be identifiable only by his signet ring. Father and stepmother, 90 minutes apart, both killed with the same ferocity, the same overkill, the same apparent rage. And somewhere in that house, the killer waited for the bodies to be discovered, for the alarm to be raised, for the chaos that would follow. The killer knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the house. They knew the schedule. They knew when Bridget would be outside and when Andrew would return. The killer was family. But what investigators would discover in the hours and days that followed, and what the prosecution would struggle to explain to a jury, was the sheer impossibility of Lizzie Borden's alibi. According to Lizzie, she was in the barn behind the house during both attacks. Not in her room, not in the sitting room, not anywhere in the house where she might have heard 19 hatchet blows crushing her stepmother's skull, or the sounds of struggle that must have preceded her father's death. She was in the barn, searching for fishing sinkers, eating pears in the loft. The barn stood about 60 feet from the main house. It was a small outbuilding used for storage, its loft accessible by a ladder. Lizzie claimed she had gone there around 9:30, precisely when Abby was being murdered, to look for lead weights she might use on an upcoming fishing trip. She claimed she spent 20 to 30 minutes in that barn, in the loft, rummaging through boxes and eating fruit. She claimed she heard nothing from the house, not the attack on Abby, not her father's return, not any commotion whatsoever. The problems with this alibi were immediately apparent. First, the heat. On August 4, 1892, the temperature inside that barn loft exceeded 100 degrees. Investigators who examined the space later that day found it almost unbearable, an oven of trapped heat that made breathing difficult and sustained activity impossible. The idea that anyone would voluntarily spend 20 to 30 minutes in that space, eating pears while searching for fishing equipment, strained credulity. Second, the dust. The barn loft floor was covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. When investigators examined it, they found no footprints, no evidence that anyone had recently walked across that surface. If Lizzie had been there, she would have left tracks. There were none. Third, the fishing sinkers. Lizzie claimed she was searching for lead weights. She never found any. No fishing sinkers matching her description were ever located in that barn. The stated purpose of her visit appeared to be fiction. Fourth, the timeline. Lizzie claimed to have been in the barn when Abby was killed and to have returned to the house just before discovering her father's body. But the medical examiner determined that Andrew Borden died at approximately 11:00 a.m., and Lizzie was the one who summoned help, claiming to have just found him. If Lizzie was in the barn for 30 minutes ending around 11:00, she would have returned to the house precisely when her father was being murdered. She would have walked in on the attack or encountered the killer fleeing. If she was in the barn earlier, she would have been back in the house during her father's murder and would have heard or witnessed it. Either way, her story didn't hold. And then there was the dress. 3 days after the murders, on August 7, 1892, Lizzie Borden burned a dress in the kitchen stove. Her friend Alice Russell witnessed the burning. Alice had been staying with the Borden sisters since the murders, offering support and companionship during the investigation. She was standing in the kitchen when Lizzie approached the stove with a light blue cotton dress and began tearing it into pieces for burning. Alice was horrified. She knew the police were still investigating. She knew that burning any clothing, especially clothing from the period of the murders, would look like destruction of evidence. "If I were you," Alice warned Lizzie, "I wouldn't let anybody see me do that." Lizzie's response was casual, dismissive. The dress was old, she said. It was stained with paint. It was of no use to anyone. Paint or blood? Alice Russell would later testify about this incident, and her testimony would be devastating. But by then it was too late. The dress was ash. Whatever evidence it might have contained, bloodstains, spatter patterns, forensic clues that might have proven guilt or innocence, had been deliberately destroyed. Lizzie Borden had burned the only physical evidence that might have connected her to the murders. And she had done it while a witness watched. What happened next would become the trial of the century, a courtroom spectacle that divided America along lines of class, gender, and belief in the fundamental nature of women. On one side stood those who believed the evidence. Lizzie had motive, opportunity, and an alibi that fell apart under examination. She had tried to buy poison. She had burned a dress. She had displayed no grief for a father she claimed to love. On the other stood those who believed in Victorian womanhood, a respectable Sunday school teacher, a member of temperance societies and charitable organizations, simply could not be capable of such savage violence. Women of good breeding did not swing hatchets. Ladies did not commit murder. First, you need to understand what investigators found inside the Borden house, and why the physical evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward a killer who knew every corner of that cramped building, who knew the family's schedules, who knew exactly when to strike and where to hide. In just a moment, you'll see the murder weapon that was never definitively identified. The handleless hatchet found in the basement, suspiciously clean, its broken shaft suggesting deliberate destruction of evidence. You'll understand why Lizzie Borden walked free despite evidence that would have convicted almost anyone else, anyone who wasn't a respectable white woman in Victorian America. The investigation that followed the Borden murders was both thorough and frustratingly inconclusive. Thorough in its documentation of evidence, frustrating in its inability to point anywhere except toward the one suspect no one wanted to convict. Police descended on 92 Street within minutes of the alarm being raised. They found a house that was already becoming a crime scene legend, a locked room mystery that seemed to have no solution consistent with a stranger killing. They searched from cellar to attic, cataloging every item, measuring every room, photographing the bodies where they lay in their darkening pools of blood. In the basement, they found hatchets. Multiple hatchets stored among the tools that any household might possess, but one stood out immediately. One demanded attention. It was a hatchet head without a handle. The blade appeared recently cleaned, conspicuously free of blood or tissue, despite the violence that had occurred upstairs. The handle had been broken off near the head, the break appearing fresh. It was as if someone had deliberately destroyed the handle, perhaps because it was covered in blood spatter that couldn't be washed away, perhaps because it contained fingerprints or other identifying evidence. Prosecutors would later argue that this handleless hatchet was the murder weapon. They would suggest that Lizzie had committed the killings, cleaned the blade as best she could, then snapped off the incriminating handle and disposed of it. The defense would argue that the hatchet proved nothing. Many tools lose their handles through normal use. The basement contained other hatchets, any of which might have been the weapon, and the blade itself showed no blood, no tissue, nothing that conclusively linked it to the murders. Both arguments had merit, and that ambiguity would define the entire case. More troubling than what investigators found was what they didn't find. No bloody clothing anywhere in the house, except on the victims themselves. The murders had been extraordinarily violent, generating blood spatter that covered walls and ceilings in the rooms where Andrew and Abby died. Anyone who committed those attacks would have been drenched in blood. Yet Lizzie, when examined by police, wore clean clothing without a visible stain. No witnesses to anyone entering or leaving the house. Bridget was washing windows outside for most of the morning. Neighbors were home, going about their daily routines. Yet no one saw a stranger approach the Borden house. No one saw anyone flee. No forced entry at any door or window. Andrew Borden, paranoid about intruders, had installed multiple locks on every entrance. Bolts, chains, mechanisms that required specific knowledge to operate. On the morning of the murders, all doors were secured from inside. No theft of any kind. Andrew Borden kept cash in his desk. Abby wore jewelry. Valuable items sat in plain view throughout the house. A burglar or robber would have taken something. Nothing was missing. No motive that pointed to anyone outside the immediate family. Andrew Borden was miserly and difficult, but he was not corrupt. His business dealings were sharp but legal. He had no enemies capable of this kind of violence, no one who would enter a locked house in broad daylight and butcher two people with an axe. The evidence, when examined objectively, pointed in only one direction. The killer was already inside the house when the murders occurred. The killer had a key or lived there permanently. The killer knew exactly when Andrew would return from his rounds. The killer knew that Bridget would be outside, absorbed in her window washing. The killer knew that Emma was away in Fairhaven. The killer knew where the hatchets were stored and how to access them. The killer was family. The killer almost certainly was Lizzie Borden. When all the evidence points toward one conclusion, but society refuses to accept that conclusion because it contradicts cherished beliefs about gender and class, is that justice? Or is it something else entirely? On August 11th, 1892, exactly 1 week after the murders, Lizzie Borden was arrested and charged with the murder of her father and stepmother. The decision to arrest her was not made lightly. The police knew the controversy that would follow. They understood that charging a respectable woman with double murder, with axe murder, the most brutal and unfeminine crime imaginable, would divide their community and make them targets of criticism. But the evidence left no alternative. Lizzie had motive. The inheritance dispute was documented. Her hatred of Abby was well known. Her fear of being disinherited was explicit. Lizzie had opportunity. She was home during both murders. Her alibi placed her mere feet from the crime scenes at the critical times. Lizzie had no credible alibi. The barn story had collapsed under examination. No dust disturbed. No fishing sinkers found. No explanation for how she could have missed the sounds of violence so close at hand. Lizzie had attempted to buy poison the day before the murders. Eli Bentz, the druggist, was prepared to testify. Lizzie had burned a dress 3 days after the murders. Alice Russell, her own friend, was prepared to testify. Lizzie had displayed no grief at the death of her father, a man she claimed to love. Witnesses were prepared to testify that her demeanor after the murders was peculiar, cold, almost detached. The circumstantial case was overwhelming. In almost any other prosecution, the defendant would have been considered doomed. But Lizzie Borden was not any other defendant. She was a woman, a respectable woman, a Sunday school teacher, a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, a person of good family and good character. The idea that such a woman could swing a hatchet into her sleeping father's face, could stand over him and strike again and again until his skull was unrecognizable. This violated everything Victorian society believed about feminine nature. The arguments that would define the trial were already taking shape. For the prosecution, evidence, motive, means, opportunity, a timeline that allowed no alternative suspect, a defendant who had tried to buy poison, burned a dress, and told lies that fell apart under scrutiny. For the defense, ideology, the fundamental impossibility of a gentle Christian woman committing acts of savage violence, the absence of bloody clothing, the lack of eyewitnesses, the principle that the prosecution must prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, and the suggestion that reasonable doubt must exist because no reasonable person could believe Lizzie Borden capable of murder. The trial was set for June 1893, 10 months away. 10 months for public opinion to form, 10 months for newspapers to publish their theories, 10 months for Fall River to divide into camps. those who believed Lizzie was obviously guilty, and those who believed she was obviously innocent. The nation would be watching, and the verdict would say as much about American society as it said about Lizzie Borden. The warning signs that Lizzie Borden might be dangerous had been present for years, visible to anyone willing to see them, ignored by a society that could not accept what they implied. Her hostility toward her stepmother was legendary in Fall River. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't subtle. Lizzie spoke of Abby with undisguised contempt in conversations with friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. She refused to call her mother or even stepmother. She made clear to anyone who would listen that she considered Abby an intruder, a gold digger, a threat to her inheritance and her place in her father's affections. Servants had witnessed screaming arguments between Lizzie and Abby, confrontations so loud and so vicious that they could be heard from the street. Neighbors had observed the cold silence that had replaced those arguments, the formal distance maintained even in a house where every room was within shouting distance of every other. Lizzie's own friends testified to her feelings. She spoke of Abby as a burden, an obstacle, a problem that needed to be solved. The language of grievance was constant, the bitterness unfading. And then there was Lizzie's behavior in the days and hours surrounding the murders. On the morning of August 4th, Bridget Sullivan, the maid, heard Lizzie laugh. It was a strange sound under the circumstances. Bridget had just told Lizzie that her stepmother had come back home after a brief errand. Abby was upstairs, making the bed in the guest room, and Lizzie, for reasons Bridget could not understand, laughed. Was it nervousness? Was it anticipation? Was it the laugh of someone whose plans were about to unfold? Bridget would wonder about that laugh for the rest of her life. Just hours before the murders, Lizzie tried to persuade Bridget to leave the house. There was a sale at Sargent's department store downtown, Lizzie said. Fabric was being sold at reduced prices. Bridget should take advantage of the bargain. It was a hot day. Wouldn't she rather be shopping than washing windows? Bridget declined. She had work to do, and the timing of Lizzie's suggestion would later seem significant. If Bridget had left, there would have been no witness to anything that happened at 92 2nd Street that morning. The killings could have occurred with no one to observe comings and goings, no one to report on the household's activities. Was Lizzie trying to clear the premises of witnesses? After the murders, Lizzie's demeanor struck observers as peculiar. She showed no tears. She displayed no hysteria, no shock, no grief that resembled what neighbors expected from a woman who had just lost her father. While the police investigated and neighbors gathered, Lizzie remained calm, almost detached. She answered questions coolly. She maintained her composure. She seemed less like a devastated daughter than like a woman managing an inconvenient situation. She didn't cry, one neighbor would later testify. I thought it strange. Strange indeed, but the strangeness went deeper than dry eyes. Her friend Alice Russell would later testify about conversations in the days before the murders, conversations where Lizzie spoke of premonitions, of danger, of a sense that something terrible was coming. At the time, Alice assumed these were expressions of anxiety. In retrospect, they seemed like something else. Like groundwork, like alibi preparation, like a woman creating a narrative of external threat so that when violence came, suspicion would focus elsewhere. Andrew Borden had enemies, Lizzie insisted, business rivals, disgruntled tenants, men he had crossed in his decades of accumulating wealth. When something happened, if something happened, everyone should remember that Andrew Borden had enemies. But Andrew Borden's enemies existed primarily in Lizzie's imagination. His business dealings were hard but legal. His reputation was that of a miser, not a criminal. The people who disliked him had no motive for murder, and certainly no access to the inside of his locked and bolted house. The only people who truly hated Andrew and Abby Borden lived under their roof. And only one of them was home on the morning of August 4th, 1892. The trial of Lizzie Borden began on June 5th, 1893, in the Superior Court of New Bedford, Massachusetts, and immediately became the most sensational legal proceeding in American history to that date. New Bedford was chosen specifically because Fall River was too inflamed by the case to provide an impartial jury. The town had been divided for 10 months, with neighbors accusing neighbors of bias, with newspapers taking sides, with the mere mention of Lizzie's name provoking arguments in public places. The courthouse was overwhelmed from the first day. Spectators lined up before dawn for the limited public seats. Newspapers from across the country, from New York, from Chicago, from as far away as London, dispatched reporters to cover every detail. Sketch artists filled galleries with images that would appear in publications worldwide. The jury was composed of 12 men, as all juries were in that era. 12 farmers, merchants, and tradesmen from Bristol County, selected for their supposed neutrality, but inevitably shaped by the same assumptions about women and violence that permeated their society. The prosecution called witness after witness, building their case brick by brick. Bridget Sullivan described the morning of the murders in exhaustive detail. The locked doors, Lizzie's presence in the house, the sounds she heard and didn't hear, the discovery of the bodies. Her testimony was clear, consistent, and devastating in its implications. Neighbors testified to Lizzie's calm demeanor after the murders, her dry eyes, her composed manner, her apparent lack of grief. Medical experts described the wounds in clinical detail that made spectators gasp and some women in the gallery faint. Andrew Borden had suffered 11 blows to the face and head, delivered with such force that his features were obliterated. Abby Borden had suffered 19 blows to the back of her skull, the first one probably fatal, the remaining 18 delivered after she was dead or dying. Eli Bentz, the druggist, was prepared to testify about Lizzie's attempt to purchase prussic acid the day before the murders, testimony that would have established a pattern of planning, of premeditation, of a woman seeking multiple methods to end her father's life. But then the prosecution suffered a devastating blow. The judges ruled Bentz's testimony inadmissible. The attempt to purchase poison, they decided, was too remote from the actual murders to be relevant. It might prejudice the jury unfairly. The drugstore evidence was excluded. The jury would never hear that Lizzie Borden had tried to buy deadly poison 24 hours before her parents were hacked to death. The prosecution presented the handleless hatchet found in the basement. They argued that Lizzie had committed the killings, then cleaned the blade and destroyed the incriminating handle. The defense countered that the hatchet proved nothing. Many tools lost handles through normal use, and the blade showed no trace of blood. The prosecution presented evidence of the burned dress. Alice Russell's testimony was clear. Lizzie had destroyed clothing 3 days after the murders, claiming it was stained with paint. Paint or blood, the jury would have to decide, but the dress itself was gone, its evidence reduced to ash. By the time the prosecution rested, they had presented a circumstantial case that seemed overwhelming. Motive, opportunity, alibi that collapsed under scrutiny, evidence destruction, demeanor inconsistent with grief. But the defense had a weapon more powerful than any evidence. They had Victorian assumptions about feminine nature, and they wielded them brilliantly. What happened in that courtroom would defy everything the evidence suggested. A verdict so shocking that it made headlines around the world, and a defendant so composed throughout the proceedings that observers couldn't decide if she was innocent or simply incapable of human emotion. But the trial record reveals something the jury was never allowed to hear. The judges made a ruling that would haunt legal scholars for generations, a decision to exclude Lizzie's own words, spoken under oath just days after the murders, from the ears of the people who would decide her fate. In just a moment, you'll discover what Lizzie said at that inquest, the contradictions, the inconsistencies, the statements that seemed to acknowledge knowledge she shouldn't have possessed. You'll understand why the prosecution believed those words proved consciousness of guilt. You'll see how the defense convinced 12 men that a Sunday school teacher simply could not have done what the evidence said she did, that believing in Lizzie Borden's guilt meant believing in the impossible. The prosecution's case collapsed not because of its weakness, but because of what the jury was never allowed to hear. On June 12, 1893, in a ruling that would be debated for over a century, the 3 judges presiding over the trial excluded Lizzie Borden's inquest testimony from evidence. This was not trial testimony, not statements made with a lawyer present and full constitutional protections in place. This was testimony Lizzie had given under oath at the coroner's inquest, just days after the murders, while the investigation was still unfolding and before she had been formally charged. That testimony was devastating. Lizzie had given multiple conflicting accounts of her whereabouts during the murders. In one version, she was in the barn for 30 minutes. In another, she was there for 20. In one version, she came down from the loft when she heard her father return. In another, she never went to the loft at all. She had contradicted herself about the burned dress, giving different explanations for why she destroyed it and what was on it. He had made statements that seemed to acknowledge advanced knowledge of the crimes, references to things she should not have known if she was truly innocent, slips of language that prosecutors believed revealed consciousness of guilt. None of it would reach the jury. The judges ruled that the inquest testimony was taken without proper warnings, that Lizzie had been questioned without understanding her rights, that admitting her own words would be unfairly prejudicial. The decision was legally defensible, barely, but its practical effect was to gut the prosecution's case. The jury would never hear Lizzie Borden's voice, never observe her contradictions, never draw their own conclusions from her own words. Without the inquest testimony, without the drugstore evidence, the prosecution was left with circumstantial evidence that could be explained away, and a defendant who looked exactly like what the defense claimed she was. Lead attorney Andrew Jennings presented Lizzie as a respectable Christian woman who had been unfairly accused by a police department that couldn't find the real killer. She was a Sunday school teacher who had devoted her life to good works. She was a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, fighting against the evils of alcohol. She was a dutiful daughter who had cared for her father despite his difficult nature. Prosecution's theory, Jennings argued, required believing the impossible. It required believing that this gentle, respectable woman had committed acts of almost unimaginable brutality, had swung a hatchet into her sleeping father's face, had stood over him and struck again and again until his skull was pulp, and then had concealed the evidence so perfectly that not a drop of blood was found on her person. Where was the bloody clothing? Gone, burned perhaps, but where was the proof? Where was the murder weapon? In the basement perhaps, but covered in blood that should have been there and wasn't. How did Lizzie commit 2 savage attacks, 90 minutes apart, without getting blood on her clothing, her skin, her hair? The defense didn't have to prove innocence. They only had to create doubt, and they created doubt by invoking the assumptions their society held most dear. The famous closing argument came from former Governor George Robinson, a man whose political connections had secured him a place on the defense team and whose eloquence would be remembered for generations. He walked toward the jury box. He gestured toward Lizzie, sitting in her black mourning dress, her face pale, her manner composed. And he asked the 12 men a question that cut to the heart of their worldview. To find her guilty, you must believe she is a fiend. Gentlemen, does she look it? The question hung in the air. The jury looked at Lizzie. They saw a woman of good family, good breeding, good reputation. They saw someone who looked like their sisters, their daughters, their wives. They could not believe she was a fiend. They could not accept that a woman who looked like that, who taught Sunday school, who dressed in mourning black, could swing a hatchet with murderous fury. The jury retired to deliberate at 3:24 p.m. on June 20th, 1893. They were out for 90 minutes, less time than Abby Borden's body had lain cooling on the floor while her killer waited downstairs. At 4:32 p.m., the foreman stood. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Women cheered. Men applauded. Lizzie Borden, who had sat motionless through weeks of testimony, through graphic descriptions of her parents' wounds, through accusations that should have produced some reaction, finally showed emotion. She collapsed in tears. Outside the courthouse, crowds celebrated. The verdict was announced to Fall River and to the nation. Newspapers printed extra editions. A Sunday school teacher had been vindicated. But in Fall River itself, among the people who had known the Bordens, who had witnessed the household tensions, who understood what had been happening inside that cramped house for years, the celebration was muted. They knew what the jury had chosen not to see. They knew what the evidence said, regardless of the verdict. They knew that Lizzie Borden took an axe and got away with it. The jury chose belief over evidence, belief in feminine nature, belief in social class, belief that respectable women simply could not commit brutal violence. Was this justice, or was it the failure of a system that couldn't see past its own assumptions? And if Lizzie was guilty, as most historians now believe, what does her acquittal say about who gets punished in America and who escapes? The acquittal of Lizzie Borden produced immediate and lasting consequences, none of them satisfying to anyone who believed in justice, and none of them providing the closure that Fall River desperately needed. No one else was ever charged with the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. Not then, not ever. The investigation effectively ended the moment the jury returned its verdict. Police had always believed Lizzie was guilty. The evidence had pointed nowhere else. The circumstances had admitted no alternative explanation. With her acquittal, they saw no point in pursuing phantom suspects who existed only in defense attorneys' arguments. The case files were closed but never sealed. The questions remained but were never answered. And the murders at 92 2nd Street passed into that peculiar category of crimes that everyone knows were solved but can never officially be acknowledged as such. Fall River Society reached its own verdict, independent of the jury's decision. Despite the legal exoneration, despite the courtroom declaration of her innocence, Lizzie Borden was shunned with a thoroughness that spoke louder than any guilty verdict could have. The social circles that had once welcomed her closed their doors. The families who had considered her a peer suddenly found themselves unavailable when she called. The charitable organizations where she had served, the very organizations that had testified to her good character during the trial, grew uncomfortable with her continued participation. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends stopped visiting. The telephone that should have rung with congratulations and expressions of support remained silent. Fall River had rendered its judgment, and its judgment was not innocent. The whispers followed Lizzie everywhere. In shops, in churches, on sidewalks where she had walked her entire life, people turned away when they saw her coming. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Children, taught by their parents perpetuating the community's verdict, would recite that terrible rhyme when she passed. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, gave her father 41. The numbers were wrong. Abby had received 19 blows, Andrew 11, but accuracy was never the point of children's rhymes. The point was memory. The point was judgment. The point was ensuring that Lizzie Borden would never escape what she had done, regardless of what 12 men in a New Bedford courtroom had decided. Even her sister Emma, who had provided an alibi of sorts simply by being away during the murders, who had stood by Lizzie throughout the investigation and trial, eventually turned against her. The two sisters had been allies for decades, united in their hatred of their stepmother, united in their resentment of their father's parsimony, united in their determination to protect the inheritance they considered their birthright. They had lived together after the murders, pooling their newly acquired wealth, presenting a united front against a community that suspected them both. But something happened between them, something that shattered the bond they had maintained since childhood. 1905, 12 years after the acquittal, Emma moved out of the house she shared with Lizzie and never spoke to her sister again. The break was absolute. No letters were exchanged. No reconciliation was attempted. Whatever Emma learned or realized or could no longer tolerate, she took to her grave without ever revealing it publicly. The sisters died within 9 days of each other in June 1927. They had not spoken in 22 years. They were buried in the same family plot, alongside the parents whose deaths had given them everything and taken everything away. What caused the final break between Emma and Lizzie? Historians have speculated for over a century. Some believe Emma discovered definitive proof of Lizzie's guilt. Perhaps a confession, perhaps evidence that had been hidden, perhaps simply an accumulation of details that made denial impossible. Others suggest the rift was personal rather than criminal. Disagreements over money, over lifestyle, over the increasingly eccentric behavior that Lizzie displayed in her later years. Still others point to Lizzie's relationship with a woman named Nance O'Neill, a relationship that scandalized even the scandal-hardened residents of Fall River. The truth died with both sisters, but the estrangement itself speaks volumes. Emma Borden had supported Lizzie through arrest, trial, and public condemnation. She had stood beside her when the entire world seemed convinced of her guilt. And then, after 12 years of that loyalty, she walked away and never looked back. What could make a sister do that, if not the weight of terrible knowledge? There was no legal accountability for the Borden murders, because the only plausible suspect had been acquitted, and double jeopardy meant she could never be tried again. Lizzie Borden walked out of that New Bedford courtroom a free woman in the eyes of the law. She could not be arrested again for the same crimes. She could not be prosecuted, no matter what evidence might later emerge. The verdict of not guilty was final and absolute. But freedom from prosecution is not the same as freedom from consequence. Lizzie used her inheritance, her share of Andrew Borden's $300,000 estate, approximately $200,000 in today's currency, to purchase exactly the kind of life her father had always denied her. She bought a mansion, not a cramped house on an unfashionable street, but a grand Victorian home in Fall River's prestigious Hill District, the neighborhood where wealthy families had always lived, the neighborhood Andrew Borden had refused to join despite having the money to do so. The house was large, elegant, and thoroughly modern, with indoor plumbing, gas lighting, and all the amenities that 92 2nd Street had lacked. She named it Maplecroft. She had the name carved into the stone gatepost, as if daring the community to question her right to live among them. And she lived there in isolation that was part self-imposed, part enforced by the neighbors who wanted nothing to do with her. She hosted occasional parties, small gatherings that attracted the curious and the unconventional, but never the respectable society that had been her father's aspiration and was now her birthright. The people who should have been her peers, the families whose daughters should have been her friends, maintained their distance with the cold precision of those who know exactly where the boundaries of propriety lie. She developed a relationship with the actress Nance O'Neill, a friendship that went beyond what Fall River considered appropriate between women, even in an era when such relationships were often overlooked as long as they remained discreet. Lizzie was not discreet. She threw lavish parties for O'Neill and her theatrical troupe. She traveled to Boston to see O'Neill perform, staying in hotels that were noted by people who noticed such things. She spent money freely on a woman who was not her relative, not her social equal, and not, in the eyes of Fall River, a suitable companion for a woman of Lizzie Borden's supposed station. The relationship may have been romantic. The relationship may have been merely intense. The precise nature of what passed between Lizzie Borden and Nance O'Neill remains debated by historians who parse every surviving letter and interview for clues. What is certain is that the relationship contributed to Emma's departure. Shortly after Lizzie began her public association with O'Neill, Emma moved out and never returned. Perhaps Emma objected to the relationship itself. Perhaps she objected to Lizzie's refusal to be discreet. Perhaps she had finally had enough of living with a sister whose every action seemed designed to provoke the community that already despised them. Or perhaps Emma simply could not bear to stay any longer in a house paid for with their father's blood. The only accountability Lizzie Borden ever faced was social. The community that had acquitted her through its jury never forgave her through its customs. She lived for 34 years after the murders, wealthy, independent, free to do as she pleased. But she lived as a pariah, as an outcast, as a woman whose name would forever be associated with the most brutal crime Fall River had ever witnessed. She was never punished by law. She was punished by isolation, by whispers, by the knowledge that everyone who saw her was silently reciting that terrible rhyme. Perhaps that was justice. Perhaps it was merely the closest thing to justice that the system could provide when it had failed so completely in the courtroom. Oral question for viewers. Lizzie Borden lived for 34 years after her acquittal, wealthy and legally free but socially condemned. Is social ostracism a legitimate form of justice when the legal system fails? Or is it simply mob judgment by another name, punishment without proof, condemnation without the protections that a courtroom should provide? Lizzie Borden died on June 1, 1927, at the age of 66, from complications of gallbladder surgery. She died in the mansion she had named Maplecroft, surrounded by the wealth her father's death had provided, isolated from the community that had never accepted her innocence. She was buried in Oak Grove Cemetery in Fall River, in the family plot where Andrew and Abby already lay, the parents whose skulls she had almost certainly crushed, now her neighbors for eternity. Emma Borden, who had not spoken to her sister in 22 years, died just 9 days later in Newmarket, New Hampshire, where she had lived in quiet obscurity since abandoning Lizzie and Fall River. She was 76 years old, and she had kept whatever secrets she possessed to the very end. She was buried in the same family plot. Andrew, Abby, Lizzie, Emma, all together in death as they had been in life, bound by blood and violence, by secrets and silences, by a single mourning that had destroyed them all in different ways. Lizzie's will revealed a final eccentricity that said something about what she had valued and what she had not. She left $30,000 to the Fall River Animal Rescue League, a substantial bequest that would fund the care of animals for generations. The gift came with specific instructions for the maintenance of her father's grave and provisions for the welfare of dogs and cats in perpetuity. She left nothing to Emma, from whom she had been estranged for decades. She left nothing to the church where she had taught Sunday school, the institution whose character witnesses had helped secure her acquittal. She left nothing to the community that had raised her and then rejected her. Only animals received her generosity in death. Only creatures who could not judge her, could not whisper about her, could not recite that terrible rhyme. The grave markers in Oak Grove Cemetery tell their own story to anyone who cares to read it. Andrew Jackson Borden lies beside Abby Durfee Borden, the husband and wife whose final mourning together ended in blood and bone fragments and violence that still shocks forensic experts who study the case files. A few feet away lies Lizzie Andrew Borden, the daughter who discovered their bodies, who stood trial for their murders, who was acquitted by a jury that couldn't believe a respectable woman capable of such savagery, and who spent the rest of her life being punished for crimes the law said she didn't commit. Nearby lies Emma Lenora Borden, the sister who stood by Lizzie through everything except the truth, who walked away in 1905 and never explained why, who died 9 days after the sister she had abandoned. 4 people, 1 family, 1 morning that changed everything. The murders remain officially unsolved. The case has never been closed. No alternative suspect has ever been credibly identified, despite over a century of amateur detectives and professional historians examining every scrap of evidence. And the rhyme that immortalized the case preserves in children's verse what the legal system could not acknowledge. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, gave her father 41. The numbers are wrong. The weapon was a hatchet, not an axe, but the essential truth remains. Lizzie Borden almost certainly killed her parents. She died a free woman anyway, and Fall River has never forgotten and never forgiven. The Borden case cast a shadow over American criminal justice that has never fully lifted, a shadow made of assumptions and failures, of evidence ignored and beliefs protected. Legal scholars have studied the trial for over a century, using it to illustrate the dangers of allowing ideology to override evidence in the courtroom. The jury's unwillingness to convict a respectable woman, despite circumstantial evidence that would have doomed almost any other defendant, became a cautionary tale about how assumptions can corrupt the pursuit of truth. The case also pioneered what would become standard true crime fascination in American culture. Before Lizzie Borden, murder trials were local affairs, covered by local newspapers, forgotten within years of their conclusions. After Lizzie Borden, the sensational trial became a national entertainment, a spectacle that crossed geographic and social boundaries, that turned defendants into celebrities and courtrooms into theaters. Books about the case began appearing almost immediately after the acquittal. Plays were written and performed. When motion pictures became possible, Hollywood produced its own interpretations. Television series, documentaries, podcasts, each new medium has found its way to Fall River and that cramped house on 2nd Street. The house itself became a monument to morbidity. 92 2nd Street is now a bed and breakfast, where guests can sleep in the rooms where Andrew and Abby died, can lie in beds positioned where their bodies were found, can walk the same creaking floors that the killer walked on that August morning. Tourists come from around the world. They pose for photographs with hatchets. They buy souvenirs featuring cartoon images of Lizzie with blood-spattered blades. They eat breakfast in the kitchen where Lizzie once burned a dress that might have been stained with blood or might have been stained with paint. The commercialization of the Borden murders says something about American culture that perhaps we would rather not examine too closely. We are fascinated by violence, by transgression, by the violation of boundaries that society constructs to maintain order. And we are especially fascinated when the transgressor is someone who should have been safe, someone respectable, someone ordinary, someone like us. Forensic experts have periodically revisited the evidence, applying techniques that didn't exist in 1892 and 1893. Modern analysis of blood spatter patterns has confirmed what investigators suspected at the time. The killer would have been drenched in blood, covered from head to foot in the evidence of violence. This makes the absence of bloody clothing on Lizzie deeply suspicious, but also potentially exculpatory if one accepts that she simply could not have committed the murders without being soaked in gore. Some experts have theorized that Lizzie committed the murders while naked or minimally clothed, stripping before the attacks, then washing herself and disposing of whatever she wore. This would explain the absence of bloody clothing, but requires accepting a level of premeditation and cold-bloodedness that even prosecutors in 1893 hesitated to attribute to her. Wound trajectory analysis has shown that the blows were consistent with a right-handed attacker of Lizzie's height and build. The angle of the strikes, the force required, the positioning of the victims, all of it points towards someone who knew them, someone who could approach without raising alarm, someone who had access to the house and the tools stored within it. In 2014, a team of investigators using contemporary forensic techniques examined photographs of the crime scene and concluded that the evidence points consistently to Lizzie Borden as the most likely perpetrator. Their analysis was not definitive. No analysis can be over a century after the fact, but it added another layer of expert opinion to the mountain that already existed. But conclusions reached a century too late cannot convict the dead. Lizzie Borden escaped justice in 1893. She escaped it for the remaining 34 years of her life, and she has escaped it ever since, protected by a verdict that can never be overturned, by a legal principle that forbids trying the same person twice for the same crime. The case remains officially unsolved. The killer was never identified by law. But everyone knows who did it. Everyone has always known. The only people who refused to see were the 12 men in that New Bedford courtroom, men who looked at Lizzie Borden and could not believe that someone who looked like her could do what the evidence said she did. Lizzie Borden's story illuminates the darkest corners of the Gilded Age bargain, the unspoken arrangement that governed women's lives in Victorian America. Women of her class were promised security in exchange for submission. They were expected to remain in their fathers' homes until a suitable husband appeared, then transfer their dependents without complaint. They would own nothing in their own names. They would control nothing about their own futures. Independence was not merely discouraged, it was barely imaginable. The bargain was supposed to work. Daughters would be cared for. Inheritances would provide for them. Fathers might be difficult, might be cold, might be miserly, but they would not abandon their own flesh and blood. But what happened when the bargain broke down? What happened when a father favored his wife over his daughters? When inheritance, the only path to freedom for a woman without profession, seemed threatened? When years of silent submission produced not security but resentment, not comfort but rage? For most women, the answer was resignation. They accepted their diminished portion and made the best of limited options. They swallowed their anger and pretended contentment. They lived lives of quiet desperation, as Thoreau had written of men, though he never seemed to notice that women's desperation was far more comprehensive. For Lizzie Borden, the answer was different. We will never know with certainty what happened in the Borden house on August 4, 1892. The evidence points one direction, but evidence is not proof, and proof died with the bodies on 2nd Street. What we know is what happened afterward. A woman who almost certainly killed both her parents, struck them down with a hatchet, crushed their skulls, destroyed their faces with the fury of decades of accumulated rage, lived another 35 years as a free citizen. She was wealthy and independent at last. She owned property. She controlled her own finances. She answered to no one except the God she had taught children to worship in Sunday school. The axe gave her what Victorian society never would, control over her own destiny. Was it murder? Almost certainly. Was it justice? That depends on how you define the term. Andrew Borden had spent decades controlling every aspect of his daughters' lives, denying them the comforts his wealth could have provided, threatening their inheritance, using money as a weapon to ensure their dependence. He had created the conditions that made murder seem like the only solution. Abby Borden had been an intruder from the beginning, a stepmother who was never accepted, whose presence was tolerated at best and resented at worst, who received the gifts and property that should have gone to Andrew's daughters. Neither of them deserved what happened to them. But perhaps the system that created the Borden household, the system that trapped Lizzie in that cramped house with no legitimate escape, deserves some share of the blame for what that house produced. The Gilded Age promised women security in exchange for submission. It delivered murder instead. And in New York City, 3 years after Lizzie's acquittal, another woman would face similar circumstances, trapped in a relationship with a man who held all the power, who had destroyed her reputation, who refused to let her go. But Maria Barbella had no inheritance to protect, no respectable reputation to deploy, no army of defense attorneys to invoke her good character. She had only a razor and the desperate courage to use it. Her story would prove that justice, when it comes at all, comes unevenly, and that some women pay for their survival while others pay for their destruction. The pattern continues, the weapons change, but the question remains the same. What do you do when you're trapped with no way out, when the system offers no escape, when the law provides no remedy, when the only path to freedom runs through violence? Florence Maybrick chose arsenic. Lizzie Borden chose a hatchet. Maria Barbella would choose a razor. Each woman answered the question in her own way, and each answer left a trail of blood that has never fully dried. In the 1890s, in the tenement districts of Lower Manhattan, a different kind of woman faced a different kind of trap. Here, among the crowded streets and cramped apartments where Italian immigrants struggled to build new lives, the rules were different, crueler in some ways, more honest in others. There were no grand houses on fashionable hills. There were no inheritances worth killing for. There was only survival, only the desperate arithmetic of too many mouths and too little bread, only the daily calculation of what could be earned and what could be endured. And there was honor. In the world that Maria Barbella came from, the sun-baked villages of southern Italy, where ancient codes governed every interaction between men and women, honor was not an abstraction. It was currency. It was survival. It was the only thing a woman truly possessed that could not be taken by force. Except that it could be taken. It was taken every day by men who saw vulnerable women and recognized opportunity. Respectability in the tenements of Lower Manhattan was not a shield. It was a commodity, easily stolen, impossible to recover. Young women worked in factories, sent money home to families who had sacrificed everything for their passage to America, and navigated a world where predatory men saw their isolation as invitation. Into this world stepped Domenico Cataldo, a man who promised love and delivered only destruction. And Maria Barbella, the woman who would become the first sentenced to die in New York's electric chair for the crime of fighting back. Her story is not about wealth or inheritance. It is not about mansions on hills or family plots in respectable cemeteries. It is about something more fundamental, more primal, more universal. It is about the right of a woman to defend what little honor she possessed, even if that defense required drawing a blade across a man's throat. Florence Maybrick had her arsenic and her alibis. Lizzie Borden had her hatchet and her respectable reputation. Maria Barbella had none of these advantages. She had only her desperation, her rage, and a straight razor sharp enough to end a life. She would use all three. Oral question for viewers. Maria Barbella came from a world where a woman's honor was her only true possession, and where losing that honor meant losing everything. When Domenico Cataldo destroyed her reputation and refused to make it right, was her response murder, or was it the only justice available to someone society had already abandoned? Maria Barbella was born in 1868 in the small Italian village of Ferrandina, a sun-baked town perched on a hillside in the province of Basilicata, in the deep south of Italy, where the Mediterranean sun beat down on stone houses and olive groves, and where poverty was as hereditary as the color of one's eyes. Ferrandina was beautiful in the way that desperate places sometimes are, ancient, crumbling, suffused with a golden light that made the hardship almost bearable. The town clung to its hill like something afraid of falling, its narrow streets winding between buildings that had stood for centuries, its people living much as their grandparents had lived, and their grandparents before them. There was no future in Ferrandina. There was only the past, repeating itself generation after generation. Young men left when they could, sailing to America, to Argentina, to anywhere that promised something other than the slow death of working land that could never quite sustain the families who depended on it. They sent money home when they had it. They sent promises when they didn't. And sometimes they sent for their families, bringing wives and children and elderly parents to a new world that was supposed to be different. The Barbella family was part of this great wave of southern Italian immigration that would transform American cities in the late 19th century. They were among the millions who crossed the Atlantic in steerage, packed into ships like cargo, enduring weeks of seasickness and fear for the chance to start over. They arrived in New York sometime in the early 1890s, settling in the densely packed Italian quarter of Lower Manhattan, a neighborhood that Americans called Little Italy and that immigrants called simply home. Home was a tenement building on one of the narrow streets south of Houston, where the air smelled of garlic and garbage, where laundry hung from fire escapes like surrender flags, where the sounds of Italian dialects mixed with the clatter of horse-drawn carts and the cries of street vendors selling everything from vegetables to newspapers to salvation. Maria's father found work as a laborer, hauling, lifting, building, destroying, doing whatever work his body could provide while his body could still provide it. Her mother took in piecework, sewing garments for pennies while her eyes slowly failed in the dim light of their cramped apartment. And Maria, young, pretty, and desperate to help her family survive, found employment in the factories that consumed immigrant labor by the thousands. The factories were cathedrals of capitalism, soaring buildings where men and women worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, breathing air thick with dust and lint, feeding machines that could take a finger or a hand or a life in the moment between one stitch and the next. Maria worked. Everyone worked. There was no alternative to work, not if you wanted to eat, not if you wanted to keep a roof over your head, not if you wanted to survive in a city that had no patience for those who couldn't keep up. Life in the tenements was brutal in ways that respectable Americans could barely imagine. Families of 8 or 10 shared 2-room apartments, sleeping in shifts, eating in shifts, living on top of one another with no privacy and no escape from the endless noise and smell and press of humanity. Disease spread through overcrowded buildings like fire through dry timber. Tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera. Children died before they could walk. Adults died before they could grow old. The tenement cemeteries filled with bodies that had traveled thousands of miles for the privilege of dying in a new country. And young women, isolated from the protective traditions of their villages, far from the watchful eyes of extended family, navigating a world where the old rules no longer quite applied, found themselves vulnerable in ways their mothers had never been. Maria Barbella was 27 years old in 1895. In the village where she was born, she would have been married at 16, a mother at 17, a grandmother before she was 40. But this was America, where the old patterns had shattered, where young women worked in factories instead of tending homes, where marriage was not arranged by families, but negotiated between individuals who might have no one to protect their interests. Maria was unmarried in a culture that considered spinsters shameful. She was poor in a city that offered limited options for women without capital. She was desperate for some path toward the respectable life she had been promised but never received, the life her parents had sacrificed everything to give her. She was about to meet the man who would destroy what remained of her hopes, and whom she would destroy in return. The turning point came when Maria met Domenico Cataldo, and everything she had hoped for began to die. Cataldo was a fellow Italian immigrant, a man who worked at the same factory where Maria spent her days, a man who seemed to offer everything she lacked. He was handsome, in the dark-eyed way that southern Italian women found attractive. He was charming, with the easy confidence of someone who had learned how to get what he wanted. And he was interested in her, interested in a way that made Maria feel seen for the first time since she had arrived in America. He brought her gifts, small things, a ribbon for her hair, a flower purchased from a street vendor, a piece of candy wrapped in paper that she kept long after the sweetness was gone. He walked her home from the factory, protecting her from the catcalls and grabbing hands that awaited women who walked alone in certain neighborhoods. He spoke of their future together. A home they would share, a real apartment perhaps with more than 2 rooms. The children they would raise, boys who would grow up American, girls who would marry well. The respectable life they would build together, far from the poverty of Ferrandina, far from the squalor of the tenements, finally achieving the dream that had brought both their families across the ocean. He spoke of marriage. The world Maria came from, these words meant everything. A promise of marriage was sacred, a commitment that could not be broken, a vow that bound a man as surely as any ceremony in any church. When Domenico Cataldo spoke of marriage, Maria believed him. She had been raised to believe such promises. She had no framework for understanding that a man might say these things without meaning them. And then, according to Maria's later testimony, he violated her. The precise nature of what happened between them was contested at trial and remains uncertain today. Maria claimed that Cataldo took her virtue by force. that he used the promise of marriage to gain access to her, then took what he wanted without her consent. Cataldo, had he lived to testify, might have told a different story. He might have claimed that Maria gave herself willingly, that she was trying to trap him into marriage, that the physical relationship was consensual, and the talk of force was merely a woman's attempt to shift blame for her own choices. We will never know his version. Maria's razor ensured that only one account would survive. But what happened next was undisputed by anyone who witnessed it. Once Cataldo had what he wanted, he refused to marry Maria. In the moral framework of Southern Italian culture, this was not merely a personal betrayal. It was destruction, complete, irreversible, and extending far beyond Maria herself. A woman who lost her virginity outside of marriage was ruined. This was not metaphor. This was social reality. She was unmarriageable, condemned to shame that no amount of good behavior could erase. She had given away the only thing of value she possessed, her virtue, her honor, her claim to respectability, and received nothing in return. The shame extended to her entire family. Her father's name was tainted. Her mother's reputation was destroyed. Any siblings she might have would struggle to find respectable matches, their prospects darkened by their sister's fall. The family honor, carefully maintained across generations, had been shattered by one man's lies. Cataldo knew this. He had grown up in the same culture. He understood exactly what he was doing when he promised marriage and then refused to deliver. He understood that he was destroying Maria as surely as if he had put a knife to her throat. And he used this knowledge as a weapon. For months after taking what he wanted, Cataldo continued to see Maria, not as a suitor, but as a tormentor. He laughed at her desperation when she begged him to make things right. He mocked her publicly in front of witnesses, calling her worthless, telling her that no respectable man would have her now. He called her a pig. He suggested that she find work more suited to what she had become, work on the streets, work in the brothels, work that matched the reputation he had given her. Maria Barbella, raised to believe that honor was everything, taught that a woman's virtue was her only true possession, heard these words and understood that her life, the life she had hoped to live, the life her parents had sacrificed for, was over. There was no path back to respectability. There was no future husband waiting to rescue her. There was no redemption available in a culture that offered women only one chance and punished the slightest failure with permanent exile. Unless she took a different path entirely. Unless she ended the life of the man who had ended hers. Oral question for viewers. In a world where a woman's entire future depended on her reputation, and where men like Cataldo faced no consequences for destroying that reputation, was Maria's response murder, or was it the only form of justice available to her? When society offers no legitimate recourse, does it share responsibility for what happens next? In the weeks before the killing, Maria Barbella's behavior grew increasingly desperate and increasingly dangerous. He confronted Cataldo repeatedly, in public and in private, demanding that he honor his promise. She appeared at his lodgings unannounced. She followed him through the streets of Lower Manhattan. She made scenes in places where respectable women were not supposed to raise their voices, let alone pursue men who had wronged them. Witnesses would later testify to what they had seen. Maria crying in the streets, her face streaked with tears and rage. Maria chasing Cataldo as he walked away laughing, his friends jeering at the spectacle she was making of herself. Maria on her knees, begging him to marry her, while he looked down at her with contempt and amusement. Each confrontation made things worse. Each public scene added to Maria's disgrace and subtracted from any remaining hope of recovery. She was not merely a ruined woman now, she was a crazy woman, a woman who had lost control, a woman whose behavior proved that she deserved whatever had happened to her. Cataldo seemed to enjoy her suffering. He could have ignored her. He could have moved to a different neighborhood, found a different factory, made himself scarce until Maria gave up or found some other way to cope with her destruction. Instead, he stayed visible. He stayed close. He made sure she knew exactly where to find him when she needed another dose of humiliation. And he continued to mock her, in front of friends, in front of strangers, in front of anyone who would listen. He told the story of how he had conquered her, how she had begged for his attention, how she was nothing, less than nothing, now that he was done with her. Maria's family watched her spiral and could do nothing to help. In the old country there would have been remedies. Brothers might have confronted Cataldo. Fathers might have demanded satisfaction. The community might have pressured a man to honor his obligations. But this was America, where the old structures had dissolved, where men faced no consequences for what they did to women, where the only justice available was the justice you made yourself. Maria stopped eating. Her clothes hung loose on her frame. She stopped sleeping, lying awake in the darkness of the crowded apartment, listening to her family's breathing and planning something that she never spoke aloud. He began talking about death, sometimes Cataldo's, sometimes her own. The distinction seemed unclear to her, as if either outcome would solve the same problem. She spoke of endings, of escapes, of paths that led somewhere other than the endless misery she was living. Her family recognized the signs of a breakdown, but had no resources to address it. There were no psychiatrists in the tenements. There were no therapists, no support groups, no medications that might stabilize a mind coming apart under unbearable pressure. There was only the family, and the family could only watch and pray. On April 25, 1895, Maria acquired a straight razor. The precise circumstances of the acquisition were never fully established. Some accounts suggest she borrowed it from her father, claiming she needed to cut fabric for a sewing project. Others suggest she purchased it from a street vendor, paying pennies for a blade that would be worth any price if it did what she intended. What is certain is that, by the morning of April 26th, Maria Barbella had a weapon and a destination. She knew where Cataldo would be. She knew his habits, his haunts, the bars where he drank with friends and boasted of his conquests. She had spent months tracking his movements, learning his patterns, preparing for a confrontation she had not yet fully defined. Now the definition was becoming clear. She found Domenico Cataldo in a bar on East 13th Street, drinking with friends, laughing at some joke, displaying no awareness whatsoever that his life was about to end. Maria approached him one final time. She asked him in front of witnesses whether he would marry her. He laughed, of course he laughed. He had been laughing at her for months. Her desperation was entertainment to him, a story he could tell, a demonstration of his power over women who were foolish enough to believe his promises. He called her a pig. Again. The word he had used so many times before, the word that reduced her to something less than human, something that deserved whatever treatment it received. And Maria Barbella drew the razor across his throat. The cut was deep, it was decisive. It was delivered with a force that nearly severed his head from his body. Cataldo fell, blood sprayed across the barroom floor. The patrons scrambled away from the young woman standing over him, razor still in hand, her eyes empty of everything except a terrible calm. She had done it. She had ended the man who had ended her. Now she would face the consequences. The killing of Domenico Cataldo was witnessed by multiple people. There would be no mystery about who committed this crime, no locked-room puzzle, no question of alternative suspects. Maria had walked into a public bar in the middle of the day. She had approached her victim in front of a dozen witnesses. She had asked him a question, received an answer she didn't like, and cut his throat while everyone watched. Cataldo died within minutes, his blood spreading across the sawdust floor while patrons pressed against the walls, afraid to approach the young woman who had done this thing. The razor was still in her hand, its blade dark with what it had taken. Maria made no attempt to flee. She didn't run for the door, didn't try to disappear into the crowded streets of Lower Manhattan, didn't do any of the things a calculating murderer might do. Instead, she sat down, she placed the razor on the table, and she waited with an expression of utter calm for the police to arrive. Her statement to the officers who arrested her was simple, direct, and utterly damning from a legal perspective. He ruined me, he would not marry me, I killed him. She had confessed, in front of witnesses, with the murder weapon still in her hand and the victim's blood still spreading across the floor. There would be no trial about what happened. The trial would be about why it happened, and whether that why made any difference under the law. The stakes were unprecedented. Maria Barbella was charged with first-degree murder, a capital offense in New York State. If convicted, she would face the electric chair. The electric chair. The words themselves carried a weight of horror that is difficult to appreciate today. The chair had replaced hanging as New York's method of execution just 5 years earlier in 1890. It was supposed to be humane, a quick, clean death by electrical current instead of the slow strangulation of the rope. But the early executions had been anything but humane. William Kemmler, the first person executed by electrocution, had required multiple jolts and had reportedly caught fire on the chair. The electric chair was new, untested, and terrifying, and no woman had ever been sentenced to die in it. Maria Barbella would be the first if she was convicted. The very idea horrified even those who believed she was guilty. Editorial pages that routinely called for harsh punishment of criminals suddenly discovered reservations about sending a young immigrant woman to such a death. Religious leaders who had never before spoken on criminal justice matters found themselves compelled to weigh in on Maria's fate. But the law was clear. First-degree murder, premeditated, deliberate killing carried the death penalty in New York State, and Maria had quite clearly premeditated this killing. She had acquired a weapon in advance. She had sought out her victim deliberately. She had approached him in a public place, asked him a question designed to provoke a response, and killed him when that response was what she expected. This was not a crime of sudden passion. This was a crime of planning and execution. The fact that the planning had been motivated by months of torment did not change the legal classification. The trial would determine whether her reasons for killing mattered. whether a woman driven to madness by a man's cruelty might deserve something other than the electric chair. It would determine whether desperation was a defense, whether the destruction of honor was mitigation, whether the law had any room for the circumstances that had led Maria Barbella to that bar on East 13th Street. And it would determine whether America was willing to execute a woman who had done what society had made it impossible for her not to do. But what emerged during the testimony at Maria's first trial would begin to transform public perception, even if it could not, in that first proceeding, save her life. Witnesses came forward to corroborate Maria's account of Cataldo's behavior. These were not character witnesses speaking in abstractions about Maria's good nature. These were eyewitnesses who had seen specific acts, heard specific words, observed a pattern of cruelty that explained, if it did not excuse, what had happened in that bar. Fellow factory workers testified that Cataldo had boasted openly of seducing Maria. He had not been discreet. He had not shown even minimal regard for her reputation. Instead, he had bragged to anyone who would listen, treating the destruction of a young woman's honor as an entertainment, as a demonstration of his masculine prowess. He had described taking her virtue. He had laughed about discarding her afterward. He had told other men to try their luck with her, since she was obviously available, since she had proven herself to be what he said she was. Neighbors reported hearing Cataldo mock Maria publicly in the streets where everyone could see. He had called her worthless. He had called her fit only for the streets. He had suggested, loudly enough for bystanders to hear, that she should find work in a brothel, since that was all she was good for now. The humiliation had been systematic and public. It had continued for months. It had been designed, whether consciously or not, to ensure that Maria had no path to recovery, no possibility of rebuilding her life, no option except despair. Medical testimony introduced a concept that was relatively new to American courts: psychic epilepsy. The term sounds archaic now, almost quaint in its attempt to give scientific language to what we might today call a psychological break. But in 1895, it represented an attempt by the defense to explain Maria's actions in terms that a jury might accept. Dr. Allen McLean Hamilton, one of the most respected alienists in America, the 19th century term for psychiatrists, testified that Maria had suffered a complete psychological collapse triggered by Cataldo's betrayal. Months of torment had overwhelmed her capacity for rational thought. The repeated humiliations had accumulated until her mind simply could not process them anymore. When she entered that bar on April 26th, Hamilton argued, Maria was not fully present. She was not making conscious choices. She was moving through a fugue state, her body acting while her mind remained somewhere else, somewhere beyond the reach of pain. She was not, he argued, capable of forming the intent required for premeditated murder. The law required that a murderer understand what they were doing, that they choose to kill with full awareness of their actions. Maria had been incapable of such understanding. She had acted automatically, mechanically, her hand moving the razor while her consciousness remained detached. And character witnesses painted a picture of Maria Barbella that contrasted sharply with the image of a cold-blooded killer. She was devout. She attended Mass regularly, prayed daily, observed the religious practices that structured life in the Italian community. She was hardworking. She had never missed a day at the factory unless illness made work impossible. She sent money home to her family, denying herself small pleasures so that others might eat. She had never been in trouble before. No arrests, no violence, no indication that she was capable of the act she had committed. The jury faced an impossible choice. On one hand, the evidence of guilt was overwhelming. Maria had confessed. Witnesses had seen her do it. The murder weapon had been in her hand. There was no question that she had killed Domenico Cataldo. On the other hand, the circumstances invited sympathy that the law had no mechanism to accommodate. Maria had been driven to madness by a man who faced no consequences for his cruelty. She had been destroyed by a system that offered her no protection and no recourse. She had done what desperate people sometimes do when they see no other way out. The jury was composed entirely of men, as all juries were in that era. These were men who had grown up in the same culture that had produced both Maria and Cataldo. They understood, at least abstractly, what it meant for a woman's honor to be destroyed. They understood that Cataldo had behaved badly, even if his behavior was not technically criminal. But they were also men of the law, and the law said that murder was murder, regardless of provocation. They deliberated, they considered the testimony, they weighed the evidence against the sympathy they might have felt. And on July 18, 1895, they returned with a verdict. Guilty, first-degree murder. Maria Barbella was sentenced to death. She would be the first woman electrocuted in New York State, the first woman to die in the terrifying new machine that was supposed to represent progress in the science of execution. The execution was scheduled for August. Maria had weeks to live, unless something changed. What happened next would become a landmark in American legal history, a public outcry so intense that it forced the machinery of justice to reverse itself, a defense strategy so revolutionary that it changed how courts treated crimes of passion for generations, and a verdict so different from the first that it seemed to come from a different century, a different country, a different understanding of what justice required. But first, you need to understand who rallied to Maria Barbella's defense, and why her case became a cause célèbre that crossed every boundary of class, ethnicity, and political affiliation. Poor Italian immigrants and wealthy society women, newspaper editors and religious leaders, feminists and traditionalists, all of them united by something in Maria's story that demanded response. In just a moment, you'll see the campaign that saved Maria from the electric chair, the petitions, the legal maneuvers, the public pressure that proved impossible to ignore. You'll understand why she walked out of prison to a hero's welcome, the woman who had cut a man's throat and been celebrated for it, the murderer who became a symbol of women's right to fight back. The death sentence imposed on Maria Barbella ignited a firestorm that crossed every boundary that normally divided American society. Boundaries of class, of ethnicity, of gender, of political belief. In the Italian immigrant community, Maria became a symbol overnight. She was every young woman who had come to America seeking a better life and found instead new forms of exploitation. She was every daughter whose parents had sacrificed everything for her future, only to watch that future destroyed by a man who faced no consequences. She was every sister, every friend, every neighbor who understood what Cataldo had done and what the law had refused to punish. Rallies were held in the Italian neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan. Men and women who rarely engaged with politics, who kept their heads down and their opinions private, suddenly found themselves marching and chanting and demanding justice for Maria Barbella. Petitions circulated through factories and tenements, gathering signatures from people who could barely write their names in English but who understood injustice in any language. Thousands signed, tens of thousands. Community leaders who normally avoided controversy, shopkeepers and priests and labor organizers, spoke out in her defense. They denounced the verdict. They questioned the trial. They asked why a system that could not protect Maria from Cataldo was now preparing to kill her for protecting herself. But it was the response from outside the immigrant community that proved decisive. Prominent society women, the wives and daughters of New York's wealthiest families, women who had never set foot in a tenement and would never meet Maria Barbella personally, mobilized on her behalf with an energy that startled everyone, including themselves. These were the same kinds of women who had rallied behind Lizzie Borden in Massachusetts, women with time and resources and social connections, women who saw in Maria's case something that resonated with their own concerns about female vulnerability and male predation. The Countess di Brazza Savognone took personal charge of the campaign. She was an Italian noblewoman living in New York, connected to the highest levels of society on both sides of the Atlantic. She had the kind of name that opened doors, the kind of presence that commanded attention, the kind of resources that could make things happen. She organized fundraising events in drawing rooms where Maria would never be welcome as a guest, but where her cause could be championed over tea and sandwiches. She hired new attorneys, competent ones, experienced ones, attorneys who would not make the mistakes that had cost Maria the first trial. She used her social connections to bring Maria's case to the attention of people who could make a difference. Journalists, politicians, judges who might be persuaded that the verdict demanded reconsideration. Newspapers that had initially treated the case as a sordid immigrant drama, a crime among foreigners, not really American, not really relevant to respectable readers, suddenly discovered its human dimensions. Editorials appeared questioning whether Maria had received adequate legal representation at her first trial. Her court-appointed attorneys had been inexperienced, overwhelmed, unable to mount the kind of defense that wealthy defendants took for granted. Legal scholars pointed out procedural irregularities that might justify an appeal. The trial judge had made rulings that were at least questionable. The jury instructions might have been improper. There were grounds, if anyone cared to pursue them, for asking a higher court to reconsider. Medical experts criticized the prosecution's dismissal of the insanity defense. Dr. Hamilton's testimony about psychic epilepsy had been sophisticated and well-supported. The jury had rejected it, but that didn't mean it was wrong. The pressure was enormous and unprecedented. Poor immigrant woman, convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to die in the electric chair, was being defended by some of the most powerful women in New York society. Her name was appearing in newspapers that had never before concerned themselves with what happened to Italian factory workers. Her case was being discussed in salons and courtrooms and legislative chambers. Within months of her conviction, Maria Barbella had something that almost no condemned prisoner had ever received, something that money could not buy and influence alone could not guarantee. A second chance. In November 1895, the New York Court of Appeals granted Maria Barbella a new trial, a ruling that saved her from imminent execution and gave her defenders the time they needed to build a proper case. The grounds for the appeal were technical, the kind of legal arguments that only lawyers fully appreciate. The trial judge had improperly instructed the jury regarding the definition of premeditation. The instructions had not adequately explained what the prosecution was required to prove. The jury might have reached a different verdict with proper guidance. But the real reason for the reversal was not legal technicality, it was public pressure. The courts had recognized what would happen if Maria Barbella died in the electric chair. She would become a martyr. Her execution would be seen as murder by the state, the killing of a woman who had been driven to kill, punished for an act that her tormentor had made inevitable. The Italian community would erupt. The women's organizations that had rallied to her defense would never forgive the legal system. The newspapers that had championed her cause would make certain that everyone understood exactly what had been done and who was responsible. The appeals court found a way out. They found technical errors that justified a new trial. They gave themselves and the state of New York an opportunity to reconsider, to try again, to perhaps reach a different conclusion. The second trial was scheduled for November 1896, more than a year after the original conviction. 14 months during which Maria would remain in prison, awaiting a verdict that could still send her to the electric chair. But 14 months was also time for her defenders to organize more effectively, time for public opinion to solidify in her favor, time for the prosecution to reconsider whether it really wanted to seek the death penalty against a woman the public had already decided was more victim than villain. This time, Maria would have competent attorneys. The Countess di Brazza-Savognone had seen to that. She would have expert witnesses who would not be dismissed or discredited. She would have the attention of a nation that had already formed its opinion about what should happen. The prosecution, for its part, remained committed to securing conviction. They had witnesses who had seen Maria cut Cataldo's throat. They had her confession, her own words spoken moments after the killing. They had premeditation, clear and undeniable. The acquisition of a razor, the deliberate seeking out of the victim, the calm demeanor after the killing. This was murder. The law was clear. The evidence was overwhelming. Whatever sympathy the defendant might attract did not change the fundamental facts. But the defense had something more powerful than facts. They had the story of a woman destroyed by a man who had faced no consequences for his destruction. They had the narrative of a society that protected predators and punished victims. They had the image of a young immigrant woman who had committed an act of desperation and was now being asked to die for it. They had a jury that might finally be willing to acknowledge what the first jury had refused to see. The second trial would determine whether Maria Barbella lived or died. But it would also determine something larger, something about what American justice would tolerate, what it would forgive, and whether the law had any room for circumstances that made crime understandable, even if not excusable. Maria's first trial resulted in a death sentence. Her second trial resulted in complete acquittal. The same act, the same evidence, two opposite verdicts. What changed between the trials, the law, the evidence, or simply how much pressure could be brought to bear on the system? And if public pressure can reverse a death sentence, what does that say about the reliability of verdicts in any case that doesn't attract public attention? The second trial revealed warning signs that the first jury had ignored or been prevented from fully considering. Expert witnesses testified at length about Maria's mental state at the time of the killing. This was not brief testimony hastily presented and quickly forgotten. This was comprehensive, detailed, scientific in a way that the first trial's defense had never achieved. Dr. Alan McLean Hamilton returned to the stand, but this time with reinforcement. Other alienists supported his conclusions. The medical consensus was clear and unambiguous. Maria Barbella had suffered a complete psychological collapse triggered by months of systematic abuse. The term they used was psychic epilepsy, a form of temporary insanity characterized by fugue states, automatic behavior, and the inability to form conscious intent. Today we might use different language. We might speak of dissociative episodes, of trauma responses, of the way prolonged abuse can fundamentally alter brain function. But the core insight was the same. Maria was not, in any meaningful sense, present when she killed Domenico Cataldo. Her body had moved, her hand had held the razor, her arm had made the cutting motion that ended his life. But her conscious mind, the part of her that could have chosen differently, could have walked away, could have decided that murder was wrong, had been absent. She had acted in a state of automatism, Dr. Hamilton explained. Her body was moving through a script that her damaged psyche had written, executing a program that her tortured mind had prepared. She was no more responsible for the killing than a sleepwalker is responsible for what they do while asleep. The prosecution pushed back, of course. They challenged the medical testimony. They suggested that the defense was manufacturing an excuse, creating a convenient mental illness to cover a deliberate murder. But the second jury was more receptive than the first. Perhaps they had read the newspapers. Perhaps they had heard the public debate. Perhaps they simply looked at Maria, small, worn, obviously traumatized by her months of imprisonment and her narrow escape from execution, and could not believe she was a cold-blooded killer. More devastating than the medical testimony was what the second trial revealed about Cataldo himself. Witness after witness described a pattern of predatory behavior that went far beyond what Maria had personally experienced. Cataldo had seduced other women with false promises of marriage. Maria was not his only victim. She was merely his most visible one, the one who had fought back, the one who had made him pay for what he did. He had boasted of his conquests to fellow workers. Not discreetly, not in private conversations, but loudly, publicly, treating the destruction of women's lives as entertainment. He had specifically targeted vulnerable immigrant women who had no protectors and no recourse. He understood the culture he was operating in. He knew that these women had no fathers or brothers who would demand satisfaction. He knew that the police would not help them. He knew that the law provided no remedy. He had weaponized shame. He understood that in Italian culture, a woman's accusation of violation would be dismissed as an attempt to trap him into marriage, while the woman herself would be destroyed by the mere admission of what had happened to her. Cataldo had created a system. He had perfected a technique. He had learned exactly how to take what he wanted from women who could not stop him and could not seek justice. And when one of those women finally stopped him, permanently, violently, with a razor across his throat, the law wanted to kill her for it. The defense painted a picture of a man who had weaponized social shame against the women he exploited. A man who knew exactly what he was doing. A man who had destroyed lives for his own pleasure and faced no consequences. Until Maria. The argument was powerful because it was true. Cataldo had been a predator. The system had enabled his predation. And Maria Barbella had been trapped by that system with no legitimate escape until she created one herself. When she killed Domenico Cataldo, the defense argued, she was not committing murder. She was executing the only justice available to her, the justice that society had refused to provide, the protection that the law had failed to offer. The second jury heard this argument, and unlike the first jury, they found it compelling. The closing arguments in Maria Barbella's second trial laid bare the fundamental question the jury had to answer, a question that went far beyond one woman's guilt or innocence. The prosecution argued what prosecutors always argue, that murder was murder, regardless of provocation. Society could not function if individuals were permitted to kill those who wronged them. Every victim has a story. Every murderer has a grievance. If we excused killing because the victim was cruel, because the killer was desperate, because the circumstances were sympathetic, then we would have no law at all. Only vengeance, only chaos, only blood. Maria Barbella had acquired a weapon. She had sought out her victim. She had approached him deliberately and cut his throat in front of witnesses. This was premeditation. This was first-degree murder. The law required conviction, regardless of how the jury might feel about the defendant or her situation. The defense argued something different, something revolutionary for its time. Maria had been driven temporarily insane by circumstances no woman should be forced to endure. She had been violated, abandoned, and publicly humiliated. The man who destroyed her had faced no consequences, had in fact boasted of what he had done, had laughed at her suffering, had made her destruction into entertainment for his friends. When Maria's mind finally broke under this unbearable pressure, she committed an act that she was incapable of understanding or controlling. She was not guilty because she was not present, not in any meaningful sense, not in the way the law required for conviction. But beyond the medical arguments, beyond the technical questions of mental state and legal responsibility, the defense made a more fundamental appeal. They asked the jury to consider what Maria's conviction would mean for every woman in her situation. If you send her to the electric chair, they argued, you tell every predator in New York that they can do whatever they want to vulnerable women. You tell them that the law will protect them even after death, that their victims will be punished for fighting back. Is that the message you want to send? Is that the society you want to live in? The jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom was packed with spectators. Women who had followed the case in newspapers had traveled from across the city to witness the verdict. Supporters of Maria filled the gallery, many of them wearing ribbons or flowers in solidarity. The atmosphere was tense. The first trial had taken less than a day to convict. What would the second trial bring? The jury was out for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood. The courtroom fell silent. Maria Barbella, pale and trembling, rose to hear her fate. The verdict. Not guilty. What happened after the verdict became a sensation that eclipsed even the trial itself. a celebration so overwhelming that it revealed how deeply Maria Barbella's case had touched a nerve in American society. The courtroom erupted, women wept, men cheered. The judge made no effort to restore order, seeming himself to be moved by the outcome. But the acquittal raised questions that would echo through criminal justice for generations. Questions about who deserves sympathy and who deserves punishment, about what the law can recognize and what it must ignore, about whether justice means the same thing for everyone or something different depending on circumstances. In just a moment, you'll see what happened when Maria walked free, the crowds that greeted her, the celebration that followed, the way she became a symbol for something larger than herself. You'll understand why her case became a turning point in how American courts treated crimes of passion. A brief moment of recognition that sometimes the real crime was committed by the victim, not the killer. The moment the verdict was announced, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Women rushed forward to embrace Maria, pushing past bailiffs who made no serious effort to stop them. Supporters who had been holding their breath for hours finally exhaled, their relief expressing itself in tears and laughter and shouts of joy. Men in the gallery cheered openly. The prosecution looked stunned, not by the verdict itself perhaps, but by the intensity of the response. The judge, who might have called for order in any other circumstance, sat quietly at his bench, apparently unwilling to interrupt this moment of collective catharsis. Maria Barbella, who had spent over a year awaiting execution, who had prepared herself for death and been saved by the narrowest of margins, collapsed into the arms of her supporters. She wept with relief and exhaustion, her body finally releasing tension it had held since that morning in the bar on East 13th Street. The verdict was official, not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. She had killed Domenico Cataldo, everyone knew it. She had confessed to it, witnesses had seen it. But the law had determined that she was not responsible, that her mind had broken under pressure, that she had acted without true consciousness, that punishment would serve no purpose. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered to await the verdict. Word spread through the streets of Lower Manhattan with the speed of rumor, traveling from person to person, block to block, until the entire Italian quarter seemed to know what had happened. Maria was free. Celebrations broke out in neighborhoods where celebrations were rare, where life was hard, work was grueling, and moments of pure joy were few. Strangers embraced in the streets. Italian immigrants who had feared that one of their own would be sacrificed to American justice now cheered for a system that had, for once, heard their voices. Society women in expensive dresses congratulated themselves on a campaign well fought. The Countess di Brazza-Savognone received credit that was entirely deserved. She had organized the defense, hired the attorneys, marshaled the resources that had given Maria a second chance. The newspapers treated the acquittal as a victory for justice, and implicitly for the proposition that some men deserved what they got. Editorial pages that had once called for harsh punishment now celebrated Maria's vindication. They wrote about the rights of women to protect themselves. They wrote about the failure of law to address crimes like Cataldo's. They wrote about the need for society to recognize that not all killings were equal, that some were more understandable than others. The Countess hosted a reception in Maria's honor, attended by the most prominent women in New York society. Maria, who had never been inside such elegant rooms, who had spent her life in factories and tenements, now stood among crystal chandeliers and silver service, receiving congratulations from ladies who had never washed their own clothes. For one brief moment, a poor Italian immigrant who had cut a man's throat in a barroom had become the symbol of women's resistance to male exploitation. She was the woman who had fought back, the woman who had refused to accept her destruction quietly, the woman who had taken the only path available to her and survived. But the celebration masked uncomfortable questions. Maria Barbella had killed a man. She had done so deliberately in public with a weapon she had obtained in advance. Under ordinary circumstances, this was murder. Under extraordinary circumstances, circumstances that the second jury had accepted but that the first jury had rejected, it was something else. The precedent was extraordinary. A jury had declared that a woman driven to kill by a man's cruelty was not criminally responsible for her actions. What did that mean for the law? What did it mean for justice? What did it mean for the next woman who found herself in Maria's situation, or the next man who found himself in Cataldo's? The celebration would fade, the questions would remain, and the brief window of sympathy that had saved Maria Barbella would begin closing almost before she had walked free. The acquittal of Maria Barbella produced immediate and profound effects on the American legal landscape, effects that would ripple outward for decades, shaping how courts understood crimes of passion and how juries responded to defendants who had been driven to violence by circumstances beyond their control. Legal scholars seized on the case almost before Maria had left the courthouse. The implications were extraordinary. If a woman could kill a man who had seduced and abandoned her and be acquitted on grounds of temporary insanity, what limits remained on the defense? Could any sufficiently sympathetic defendant escape punishment for premeditated murder simply by claiming emotional distress? The traditional legal framework held that murder was murder, regardless of provocation. The law did not ask whether the victim deserved what happened to them. The law did not weigh the suffering of the defendant against the finality of the victim's death. The law simply asked, did this person kill that person? If yes, punishment must follow. Maria Barbella's acquittal challenged that framework in fundamental ways. Her case suggested that circumstances mattered, that not all killings were morally equivalent, that some defendants deserved sympathy rather than punishment, that juries could and should consider the human context of violence when determining guilt. Some observers celebrated this development as recognition that the law had been blind to women's suffering for too long. For centuries, men had exploited vulnerable women without facing consequences. They had made promises they never intended to keep. They had taken what they wanted and discarded what remained. And the law had stood by, offering no remedy, providing no protection, allowing predators to operate with impunity. Maria Barbella's acquittal from this perspective was not a miscarriage of justice, but its fulfillment. It was the law finally acknowledging what everyone already knew, that Domenico Cataldo had committed a crime against Maria, even if that crime had no legal name. That his death, while violent, was not unjust. That sometimes the victim and the villain were not who they appeared to be. Others warned of dangerous precedent. If juries were empowered to nullify clear evidence of guilt based on sympathy for the defendant, the entire criminal justice system would collapse. Every murderer had a story. Every killer had suffered something that might, if viewed sympathetically, seem to explain or excuse their actions. Murder was murder. The law could not function if verdicts depended on how much the jury liked the defendant or despised the victim. What Maria Barbella had done was, objectively, premeditated killing. The fact that Cataldo was cruel did not change the nature of her act. The debate would continue for decades, and would be revisited each time a woman killed a man who had wronged her, each time defense attorneys invoked Maria Barbella's case as precedent, each time prosecutors argued that sympathy should not override evidence. But for Maria herself, the legal debate was abstract, irrelevant to the practical reality of her situation. She had killed a man and been acquitted. She had spent over a year in prison awaiting execution. She had looked death in the face and been pulled back at the last moment by forces she barely understood, wealthy women she had never met, attorneys she could never have afforded, a public outcry that had transformed her from immigrant murderer to symbol of resistance. Now she needed to rebuild a life that had been destroyed twice over. First by Cataldo, who had taken her honor and her future. Then by the legal system, which had taken her freedom and nearly taken her life. She emerged from that courthouse with nothing except her acquittal. No money, no prospects, no clear path forward. The name Maria Barbella would follow her forever, associated with violence, with scandal, with a killing that some celebrated and others condemned. How does a woman build a life after that? How does she find work, find love, find peace when everyone who meets her knows exactly what she did? Maria was about to find out. There was no accountability for Domenico Cataldo's treatment of Maria Barbella, because the only person who might have held him accountable was the woman who killed him. This was the bitter irony at the heart of Maria's case, the contradiction that made her acquittal both a triumph and an indictment. In the moral framework of 1895 America, Cataldo had committed no crime. There was no law against seduction under false pretenses. There was no statute prohibiting the destruction of a woman's reputation. There was no legal remedy for the systematic psychological torture he had inflicted on Maria for months after taking what he wanted. Seduction was distasteful, perhaps. It was immoral, certainly, at least by the standards that churches preached and society claimed to uphold. But it was not illegal. The destruction of a woman's honor was a personal matter, not a public concern. And the casual cruelty Cataldo displayed toward Maria, the mockery, the public humiliation, the deliberate prolonging of her suffering, was simply how some men treated women they considered beneath them. The law offered Maria no recourse. She could not sue Cataldo for damages. She could not have him arrested for what he had done to her. She could not even publicly accuse him without further destroying her own reputation, since the mere acknowledgement of what had happened between them marked her as damaged goods. The system was designed to protect men like Cataldo and to punish women like Maria. It worked exactly as intended, right up until the moment Maria decided to create her own form of justice. Cataldo faced no legal consequences for his behavior during his lifetime. He faced no social consequences. His reputation among his friends and fellow workers was, if anything, enhanced by his conquests. He faced no professional consequences. He kept his job, maintained his income, lived his life as if the destruction of Maria Barbella was simply an amusing episode in an otherwise unremarkable existence. And then he faced Maria's razor. His death ensured that he would never face any other form of accountability. He was buried in New York, mourned by whatever family he had, and largely forgotten except as a footnote to Maria's story. His grave, if it still exists, bears no indication of who he was or what he did. History remembers him only as a victim, which in the final moments of his life he certainly was. The accountability, such as it was, fell entirely on Maria. She had spent over a year in prison awaiting execution. She had endured the humiliation of public trial, twice. She had been examined by doctors, questioned by lawyers, discussed by journalists who felt entitled to dissect every aspect of her life and psychology. Her name was forever linked to the murder she had committed, regardless of acquittal. For the rest of her life, she would be Maria Barbella who killed that man, Maria Barbella who cut that throat, Maria Barbella who almost died in the electric chair. The acquittal removed the legal penalty but not the social consequence. She was free, but she was also marked, and she would carry that mark until she died. The system that had enabled Cataldo's predation, the social structures that left vulnerable immigrant women without protection or recourse, the legal framework that criminalized their responses while ignoring their suffering, remained entirely untouched. Maria Barbella's case changed nothing about how men treated women. It changed nothing about how society responded when women were destroyed. It created no new laws, established no new protections, reformed no institutions. It merely demonstrated that occasionally, at great cost, with the support of wealthy patrons and favorable publicity, one woman might be permitted to fight back without being killed for it. One woman out of thousands, out of millions. The exception that proved the brutal rule. Oral question for viewers. Maria's acquittal was celebrated as justice, but the system that created her situation remained unchanged. If individual verdicts can't reform unjust institutions, what purpose does justice serve? Is it enough to save one woman when the conditions that endangered her continue to endanger others? Maria Barbella emerged from her ordeal determined to salvage what remained of her life, to prove that she was more than the worst thing she had ever done. Within months of her acquittal, she married. His name was Francesco Paolo Bruno, and he had supported Maria throughout her trial. He had attended court proceedings. He had visited her in prison. He had believed in her innocence, or at least in her right to have done what she did, when believing such things required courage that many men would not have found. Whether their relationship had existed before the killing, or whether it developed during Maria's imprisonment, is unclear from the historical record. What is clear is that Francesco Bruno saw something in Maria Barbella that the prosecutors and the first jury had refused to see. A human being worthy of love, despite everything. They married quietly, without the publicity that had surrounded every other aspect of Maria's case. The wedding was not announced in newspapers. The guests, if there were any, left no record of their attendance. It was a private moment in a life that had been relentlessly public, a small act of normalcy after months of spectacle. Together, they attempted to build the respectable life that Cataldo had stolen from Maria. They had children. How many and when is not fully documented. The children would grow up knowing their mother's history or perhaps carefully shielded from it. They would carry the Barbella name into the 20th century, the surname that had once appeared in headlines across America now quietly fading into immigrant anonymity. The marriage appears to have been happy, or at least functional. Maria bore children. She kept house. She attended church, returning to the religious practices that had sustained her before everything fell apart. She made every effort to disappear from public view, to become just another immigrant woman rather than the famous defendant who had nearly been electrocuted for murder. She succeeded more or less. Reporters sought her out periodically in the years following her acquittal, asking for interviews, for reflections, for statements about what she had learned or how she had changed. Maria generally refused. She had no interest in reliving the worst period of her life. She had no desire to become a symbol for causes she had never chosen to represent. She had wanted only to survive. She had survived. Now she wanted to live quietly, without attention, without judgment, without the constant reminder of what Domenico Cataldo had done to her and what she had done to him. The past was never entirely escapable. How could it be when every person who knew her story carried it in their minds? But it could be managed. It could be pushed to the margins of daily existence. It could be survived the way so many things in immigrant life had to be survived. Maria Barbella lived into the 20th century. She saw New York transform from a city of horse-drawn carriages to a city of automobiles. She witnessed world wars and technological revolutions and social changes that would have been unimaginable to the young woman who had arrived from Ferrandina with nothing but hope and determination. She had achieved everything the Gilded Age promised and denied: survival, respectability, and a second chance. The price had been higher than anyone should have to pay. But she had paid it, and she had endured, and she had built something that resembled a life from the wreckage that Cataldo and the courts had left behind. That was perhaps the only victory available to her, and she claimed it. The Barbella case left a complicated legacy in American law, a legacy of doors briefly opened and then slammed shut, of possibilities glimpsed and then denied. On one hand, Maria's acquittal demonstrated that juries could be persuaded to see beyond the bare facts of a killing to the circumstances that produced it. This created openings for future defendants, particularly women who killed abusive or exploitative men. Defense attorneys would cite Maria Barbella for generations, arguing that their clients deserved the same consideration, the same willingness to acknowledge that some victims had created their own murderers. The temporary insanity defense, which had seemed exotic and perhaps incredible at Maria's first trial, gained legitimacy from her second. Courts became more willing to hear testimony about defendants' mental states, about the psychological damage that could result from prolonged abuse, about the ways that extreme circumstances could overwhelm normal moral functioning. On the other hand, the backlash was significant and swift. Prosecutors became more aggressive in challenging insanity defenses. They hired their own expert witnesses, alienists who would testify that the defendant was perfectly sane, perfectly responsible, perfectly aware of what they were doing. The battle of experts that had characterized Maria's trial became standard in cases involving mental state defenses. Judges became more restrictive in allowing testimony about victims' character. The argument that the victim deserved what happened to them, the argument that had saved Maria, was increasingly viewed as an attempt to put the victim on trial rather than the defendant. Courts began limiting such testimony, requiring defendants to show specific relevance rather than simply attacking the deceased. The brief window of sympathy that had saved Maria Barbella began closing almost immediately after her acquittal. Later cases would not always end so favorably. Women who killed their abusers would be convicted and executed, their circumstances deemed insufficiently sympathetic, their victims deemed insufficiently villainous. The temporary insanity defense would be narrowed and questioned, its boundaries defined in ways that excluded many who might have benefited from Maria's precedent. And the fundamental problem that Maria's case had exposed, the absence of legal recourse for women exploited by men, would remain largely unaddressed for another century. Rape shield laws, which would protect victims from having their sexual history used against them in court, were still decades away. Domestic violence protections, which would criminalize the kind of psychological abuse Cataldo inflicted on Maria, would not become widespread until the late 20th century. The recognition that coercive control was a form of abuse, that destroying someone's reputation was a kind of violence, that systematic humiliation could constitute grounds for legal intervention. All of this lay in a future that Maria would not live to see. Maria Barbella was lucky. That was the uncomfortable truth her case revealed. She had the right combination of circumstances, supporters, and timing to survive. A wealthy noblewoman took interest in her case. Newspapers found her story compelling. Public opinion shifted in her favor before it was too late. Countless other women, facing similar situations, were not so fortunate. They were convicted and imprisoned. They were executed. They took their own lives rather than face what the system would do to them. They disappeared into the margins of history, their stories never told, their suffering never acknowledged. Maria's story endures because she survived, but it endures also as a reminder that justice, when it comes at all, comes unevenly. Some women get second chances, most do not, and the difference often has nothing to do with what they did or why they did it, only with whether someone powerful enough noticed their suffering and decided to help. Maria Barbella's story forces us to confront questions that remain uncomfortable today. Questions about justice and vengeance, about protection and punishment, about what we owe to people who have been failed by every institution designed to help them. When legal systems fail to protect the vulnerable, do the vulnerable have the right to protect themselves? When men destroy women's lives without consequence, is violence the only response available? Maria Barbella answered these questions with a razor across a man's throat. A jury, composed entirely of men, in an era when only men could serve, looked at the evidence and concluded that she was justified. Whether they were right remains debated. Whether their verdict represented justice or merely sympathy, law or merely emotion, remains contested by legal scholars who still cite the case in classrooms and courtrooms. But their verdict acknowledged something that the law had long refused to see, that the destruction of a woman's honor was itself a form of violence, and that violence in response might be understandable, even if not formally excusable. Florence Maybrick used arsenic and went to prison for 15 years, convicted by a jury that couldn't forgive her adultery, punished for a crime she may not have committed. Lizzie Borden used a hatchet and walked free, protected by assumptions about feminine nature that couldn't accommodate the evidence of her guilt. BARBELLA used a razor and survived, saved by a public campaign that recognized her as victim rather than villain. 3 different women, 3 different weapons, 3 different outcomes. But the pattern is unmistakable. The underlying truth is constant. In the Gilded Age, when a woman's options ran out, sometimes the only path forward ran through a man's corpse. And the question of whether that path led to punishment or freedom depended less on what the woman did than on who she was, who her supporters were, and whether the system was willing to see her suffering or only her crime. Our next subject would take that pattern to its logical extreme, planning a murder so cold-blooded, so calculated, and so utterly devoid of the desperation that had driven Florence, Lizzie, and Maria that even the most sympathetic observers could find no excuse. Ruth Snyder killed for money, pure and simple, no tormented love affair, no destroyed honor, no years of abuse that might explain or mitigate what she did. She wanted her husband's insurance money, she enlisted her lover to help her get it, and she posed for photographs at the crime scene. There would be no public outcry to save Ruth Snyder. There would be no second trial, no sympathetic experts, no wealthy patrons organizing on her behalf. There would only be the electric chair, the same chair that had almost claimed BARBELLA, finally claiming its first female victim. And a photograph that would haunt America for generations. The most dangerous place for a husband in 1920s America wasn't a speakeasy filled with bootleggers and gangsters. It wasn't a gambling den where debts could accumulate and creditors could demand violent repayment. It wasn't even a dark alley in a rough neighborhood where robbery could turn to murder in an instant. The most dangerous place for a husband was his own bedroom, with a wife who had taken out an insurance policy on his life. The women we've met so far killed in circumstances that invited, if not sympathy, at least understanding. Florence Maybrick was trapped in a marriage to an older, violent, self-medicating man who struck her in public and poisoned himself in private. Whether she killed him or merely failed to save him, her circumstances were pitiable. Lizzie Borden lived under a father who favored his wife over his daughters, who threatened to disinherit them, who made their cramped house a prison of resentment and silence. Whatever happened that August morning was the explosion of decades of accumulated rage. BARBELLA was driven to madness by a man who destroyed her and laughed about it, who weaponized shame against her, who left her no path to survival except the one that ran through his throat. But Ruth Snyder killed her husband for $48,000 in insurance money. She didn't love another man so desperately that murder seemed the only solution. She didn't fear for her life or her reputation. She wasn't trapped by circumstances that made violence the only escape. She simply wanted money, more money than she had, more money than her husband would give her while he was alive. She enlisted her lover to help, not because she loved him, though she may have told him she did, but because she needed someone to wield the sash weight and tighten the garrote while she established her alibi. She posed for photographs at the crime scene, playing the grieving widow while her husband's body cooled in the next room. She collected the insurance money, or tried to, before anyone realized what she had done. There was no desperation in Ruth Snyder's crime, no psychological break, no provocation that might explain what she did. Just cold calculation, just greed dressed up in widow's weeds, just the absolute certainty that she would never be caught. She was wrong. And unlike Florence, unlike Lizzie, unlike Maria, Ruth Snyder would find no sympathy, no second chance, no public campaign to save her. She would find only the electric chair, and a photographer with a camera strapped to his ankle, ready to capture the moment of her death for 1 million morning newspapers. Oral question 4 viewers, Florence, Lizzie, and Maria killed in circumstances that invited understanding. Ruth Snyder killed for money. Does motive determine how we should judge violence? Is a murder motivated by desperation more forgivable than one motivated by greed? Or is killing regardless of why? Speaking of women who fought back against impossible circumstances, if you're finding these stories as fascinating as we do, a like helps more than you might think. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep dive documentary deserves to be seen by more people. People who appreciate real history, documented evidence, and the uncomfortable questions that most content creators are afraid to ask. Now back to Queens, where Ruth Snyder was about to prove that not all deadly wives deserve sympathy, and that some crimes have no excuse. Ruth Mae Brown entered the world on March 27, 1895, in Manhattan, New York, a city that promised everything to those with ambition and offered nothing to those without. Her parents were working-class Scandinavian immigrants, respectable but unremarkable, the kind of people who kept their heads down and hoped their children might climb a rung or two on the social ladder. Ruth was determined to climb faster. By her early 20s, she had transformed herself from a typist into a woman of fashion, blonde, attractive, with an eye for expensive clothes, and a taste for the finer things that her salary could never provide. She worked as a telephone operator, then as a secretary, always scanning the horizon for the opportunity that would lift her out of the ordinary life she had been born into. She understood, with the clarity that comes from watching her mother scrub floors and count pennies, that beauty was currency, and currency was the only language that Manhattan truly respected. She found that opportunity in Albert Snyder. Albert was 13 years older than Ruth, a successful art editor for Motor Boating magazine, a man with a house in Queens, a steady income, and the stability that Ruth's life had always lacked. He was respectable. He was established. He was, by the standards of 1915, a catch. He was also, by all accounts, deeply in love with another woman. Her name was Jessie Gishard, and she had died before Albert could marry her. But death had not ended Albert's devotion. He kept Jessie's photograph in the house, displayed prominently where any visitor and any wife would see it daily. He spoke of her often, his voice softening in a way it never did for Ruth. He named his boat after her. He compared every woman he met to her memory, and every woman fell short. Ruth married him anyway in 1915. She was 20 years old. She believed that security was worth whatever compromises it required. She believed that Albert's devotion to a dead woman would fade with time, replaced by appreciation for the living wife who shared his bed and bore his children. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about many things. But perhaps the thing she was most wrong about was this. She believed she could endure a loveless marriage indefinitely, that the trade she had made, youth for security, passion for stability, would sustain her through the decades ahead. It would not, and the consequences of that miscalculation would be paid not just by Ruth, but by everyone who loved her. The marriage that had promised security delivered something else entirely: suffocation. Albert Snyder was not a cruel man by the standards of the era. He provided for his family. He came home at reasonable hours. He didn't drink to excess or raise his hand to his wife. By the metrics that society used to measure husbands, Albert passed every test. But metrics cannot measure the slow death of hope. Albert was cold where Ruth craved warmth. He was practical where she yearned for romance. He came home, ate dinner, read his newspaper, and went to bed, night after night, year after year, a routine so unchanging that Ruth could have set her watch by his footsteps on the stairs. The photograph of Jessie Gishard remained prominently displayed, a daily reminder that Ruth was a replacement, a second choice, a living woman competing with a ghost she could never defeat. When Ruth gave birth to their daughter, Lorraine, in 1918, she hoped the child might awaken something in Albert, some warmth, some tenderness, some acknowledgement that their family was worth cherishing. Instead, Albert suggested naming the baby after Jessie. Ruth refused, but the suggestion revealed with brutal clarity where Albert's heart truly lay. It lay in a grave with a woman who had been dead for years, and no amount of devotion from his living wife would ever redirect it. For years, Ruth endured. She decorated her Queens home with the fashionable touches that Albert's income could provide. She raised her daughter. She played the role of suburban housewife with a perfection that fooled neighbors and relatives alike. Behind the facade, she was dying, not physically, but in every way that mattered. She fantasized about a different life, a life with excitement, a life with passion, a life with a man who actually wanted her. Then in 1925, at a restaurant in Manhattan, Ruth Snyder met Henry Judd Gray. Gray was a corset salesman, a slight, bespectacled man of 34 who seemed, at first glance, an unlikely object of passion. He was not handsome, he was not wealthy, he was not particularly interesting. But he was attentive where Albert was indifferent. He was romantic where Albert was practical. He looked at Ruth with a hunger that Albert had never shown, and Ruth, starved for attention, desperate for validation, responded with an intensity that surprised them both. Their affair began within weeks of their first meeting. Gray, married with a daughter of his own, fell utterly and completely in love with Ruth. He called her Momsy, a pet name that revealed both his devotion and his weakness. She called him Lover Boy, a nickname that was equal parts affection and condescension. Together, they conducted an affair that would last 2 years, generate hundreds of letters, and ultimately leave one man dead and 2 people strapped into the electric chair. The only question was how long Ruth would wait before deciding that Albert's death was the solution to all her problems. Ruth Snyder's path from adultery to murder was not impulsive. It was methodical, calculated, and chillingly patient. Beginning in 1925, almost immediately after her affair with Judd Gray commenced, Ruth began taking out insurance policies on Albert's life. The first was modest, $1,000, the kind of policy that any prudent wife might purchase. Then came another for $5,000, then $10,000. Each policy was purchased separately, from different companies, sometimes without Albert's knowledge, sometimes with his signature forged so skillfully that investigators would later struggle to determine which signatures were genuine. In 1927, Albert Snyder was insured for over $96,000. In today's currency, that figure translates to approximately $1.7 million, a fortune by any standard, and an amount so disproportionate to Albert's actual worth that it should have raised immediate suspicions. Several policies contained double indemnity clauses, meaning the payout would be doubled if Albert died by accident or violence. Ruth knew exactly what she was purchasing. She was not buying security for her family. She was buying a motive for murder. And Ruth was not subtle about her intentions. Made multiple attempts on Albert's life before the final, successful attack. She left the gas on in the house, hoping he would be asphyxiated in his sleep. He woke up, noticed the smell, and opened a window. She gave him bichloride of mercury, poison mixed into his whiskey. He became violently ill, suffering for days, but survived. She tried to arrange a car accident that never quite materialized, her plans frustrated by circumstances that seemed almost providential. Each attempt failed. Each failure made Ruth more determined, and each conversation with Judd Gray moved closer to the inevitable conclusion. If Ruth wanted Albert dead, she would need help. She would need someone willing to do what she could not, someone who would strike the fatal blow while she established an alibi. Gray, besotted and weak-willed, could deny her nothing. When Ruth proposed that they murder Albert together, Gray agreed. He would later claim that Ruth had hypnotized him, that he was powerless to resist her commands, that her personality had overwhelmed his own until he was merely an extension of her will. The jury would not believe him, neither should we. But the question lingers: when does influence become coercion? When does a weak will become an excuse? If someone manipulates you into committing a crime, how much of the guilt belongs to them, and how much belongs to you? By early 1927, Ruth Snyder had assembled everything she needed for murder, except the nerve to commit it herself. The plan was brutally simple. Ruth would leave a side door unlocked while she and Albert attended a party at a neighbor's house. Judd would enter during their absence and wait, hidden in a closet, for the Snyders to return. When they did, Ruth would ensure that Albert fell into a deep sleep, using chloroform if necessary. Then Judd would emerge from hiding and strike. The weapon would be a sash weight, a heavy metal bar used to counterbalance windows. It was ordinary, untraceable, and deadly. Stakes were enormous, and Ruth had calculated them with the precision of an accountant. Double indemnity on $96,000 meant Ruth would receive nearly $200,000 if Albert died violently. In today's currency, that translates to over $3 million, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, enough to escape the suffocating marriage that had trapped her for over a decade, enough to start fresh with Judd or anyone else she chose. But the plan required Judd Gray to do what Ruth could not. It required him to enter a stranger's home with a weapon and use it to end a human life. Gray was no murderer. He was a slight, nervous man who sold women's undergarments for a living. His hands were soft. His constitution was weak. The idea of bludgeoning someone to death should have been unthinkable. Yet Ruth had convinced him that it was not only thinkable, it was necessary. She painted herself as the victim of a cruel, indifferent husband. She hinted that Albert had been violent toward her, though no evidence of such violence ever emerged. She promised Gray that once Albert was dead, they would be together forever, a future of passion and freedom that would make any sacrifice worthwhile. Gray believed her, or perhaps he simply couldn't imagine defying her. Perhaps his will had become so entangled with hers that he no longer recognized where her desires ended and his began. On the night of March 19, 1927, Judd Gray entered the Snyder home through the unlocked door. He climbed the stairs. He found the closet Ruth had designated, and there he waited, a sash weight in his pocket, his heart pounding, while Ruth and Albert spent their final evening at a party neither would remember. When they returned, Albert Snyder had less than an hour to live. But what neither Ruth nor Judd anticipated was how badly their plan would unravel, and how quickly the facade would collapse. The murder itself was botched from the beginning. Albert and Ruth returned from the party after midnight. Albert, tired and unsuspecting, went to bed. Ruth waited until he was asleep, then signaled Judd to emerge from his hiding place. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Then Judd struck his first blow, and everything went wrong. The sash weight, swung tentatively by a man who had never committed violence in his life, connected with Albert's skull, but the blow was weak, uncertain, the stroke of an amateur. Albert, dazed but not disabled, began to fight back. He grabbed at his attacker. He struggled. He tried to cry out. For terrible minutes, the bedroom became a battlefield. Ruth watched as Judd struck again and again, his panic mounting with each ineffective blow. Finally, Ruth herself intervened, soaking a rag in chloroform and pressing it to Albert's face, helping Judd loop a wire garrote around her husband's throat. Albert Snyder died slowly, painfully, surrounded by people who should have loved him. The scene was chaotic, nothing like the clean, quick killing Ruth had imagined in her careful planning. Blood stained the sheets. Furniture was overturned, and in the aftermath, both conspirators made mistakes that would prove fatal to their hopes of escape. They staged the house to look like a burglary gone wrong. They scattered jewelry and papers. They tied Ruth up loosely, so loosely that she could easily free herself to discover the crime and call for help. But they left evidence everywhere. Judd's tie pin, bearing his initials, fell from his pocket during the struggle and remained on the bedroom floor. Ruth's story about masked intruders collapsed under basic questioning. The knots were too loose, her injuries too minor, her demeanor too calm for a woman who had just witnessed her husband's violent death. And most damning of all, insurance investigators quickly discovered the mountain of policies Ruth had accumulated, each one pointing toward premeditation. Within 48 hours of Albert Snyder's death, both Ruth and Judd were in custody. Within a week, they had confessed, each desperately blaming the other for the murder they had committed together. The trial that followed would become the most sensational criminal proceeding of the 1920s, covered by newspapers across the world. And it would end in the first double electrocution in New York history, a man and woman dying together for a crime they had committed together. What happened next would captivate the nation for months, a trial so dramatic that it inspired novels, films, and countless retellings, a verdict so inevitable that even the defendant's own attorneys seemed resigned to it, and an execution so controversial that one photographer would risk everything to capture it. First, you need to understand why the American public turned against Ruth Snyder with a fury that surprised even hardened observers, and why Judd Gray, who had wielded the murder weapon, was treated almost with pity while Ruth was condemned as a monster. Was it the crime that horrified them, or was it the idea of a woman who refused to accept her place? In just a moment, you'll see the photograph that made Ruth Snyder the most hated woman in America, and why her final moments became the most famous image of capital punishment ever taken. The investigation into Albert Snyder's death collapsed the carefully constructed fiction within hours, not days, not weeks, but hours. The detectives who arrived at the Queen's home that March morning were not fooled for a moment. Ruth's story, that masked intruders had broken in, attacked her husband, and tied her up, was transparently absurd from the first telling. The ropes binding her wrists were so loose that officers noted she could have freed herself at any moment with minimal effort. The stolen jewelry was found hidden in a mattress, barely concealed, as if the thief had forgot to actually steal it. And Ruth's demeanor struck every investigator as profoundly wrong. She was too calm, too composed, too focused on practical matters for a woman who had supposedly just witnessed her husband's brutal murder. She asked about the insurance policies before she asked about funeral arrangements. Under questioning that began gentle and grew relentless, Ruth's story shifted like sand. First, she admitted to the affair with Judd Gray, a devastating revelation, but one she hoped might explain any evidence linking him to the scene. Then she admitted to the insurance policies, claiming she had purchased them out of prudent concern for her daughter's future. And finally, cornered by inconsistencies she could not explain, she admitted that Judd had killed Albert. But she insisted, with an earnestness that convinced no one, that she had no prior knowledge of the plan. Judd had acted alone, she claimed. She was as shocked as anyone. She was a victim, not a conspirator. This version of events lasted until police found Judd Gray's tie pin on the bedroom floor. Confronted with physical evidence placing her lover at the murder scene, evidence that proved he had been in the bedroom during the attack, Ruth's careful fiction collapsed completely. She confessed to the conspiracy, to the months of planning, to the previous attempts on Albert's life that had failed. She described the insurance policies, the chloroform, the sash weight hidden in the closet where Judd had waited. But even in confession, Ruth tried to deflect blame. Judd had been the driving force, she claimed. He had pressured her. He had manipulated her emotions until she agreed to something she never truly wanted. She had been weak, yes, but weakness was not murder. No one believed her. Judd Gray, arrested in Syracuse where he had fled after the crime, told a mirror-image story. He painted Ruth as the mastermind, a seductress of almost supernatural power who had used him as a weapon, manipulating his emotions until he would do anything she asked. He described her influence in terms that bordered on the mystical. She had me in her power, he told investigators. I was like a man hypnotized. I couldn't refuse her anything. He claimed she had given him liquor to steal his nerves on the night of the murder. He claimed she had handed him the sash weight and urged him forward when he hesitated. He claimed that every blow he struck was struck at her command, that his hands were merely instruments of her will. Two confessions, two different stories, both pointing fingers at the other, and both ultimately pointing toward the same inescapable conclusion: premeditated murder for profit committed by two people who deserved whatever punishment the law could provide. On April 18, 1927, less than a month after Albert Snyder's body was discovered, a Queens County grand jury returned indictments against both Ruth Snyder and Henry Judd Gray. The charge was first-degree murder. The penalty, if convicted, was death. The decision to try them together was deliberate and strategic. Prosecutors understood something fundamental about human nature. When two defendants share a courtroom, they inevitably turn on each other. The mutual recrimination that would follow would make conviction easier for both, and would provide exactly the kind of spectacle that sold newspapers and satisfied the public's appetite for drama. District Attorney Richard Newcomb was confident. He had confessions from both defendants. He had physical evidence. He had a clear motive, nearly $200,000 in insurance money. And he had something even more valuable, a story that confirmed everything the American public wanted to believe about dangerous women and weak men. The trial was scheduled for late April in the Queens County Courthouse. It would last 18 days, and it would draw more press attention than any criminal proceeding in living memory. Newspapers dispatched their finest writers to cover the case. The New York Daily Mirror alone assigned 12 reporters, each focusing on different angles: the legal proceedings, the defendant's demeanor, the reactions of spectators, the fashion choices of the women in attendance. The New York Times provided sober coverage. The tabloids provided everything else: speculation, sensation, moral condemnation dressed as journalism. Photographers jostled for position outside the courthouse each morning, capturing images of Ruth arriving in her stylish clothes, Judge shuffling behind his attorneys, the crowds that gathered hopping for a glimpse of the infamous lovers. And the crowds were enormous. Women lined up for hours to secure seats in the gallery, some arriving before dawn to ensure admission. They came dressed in their finest clothes, as if attending theater rather than a murder trial. They brought opera glasses to better observe the defendant's expressions. They whispered commentary to their neighbors when testimony grew especially dramatic. The trial was entertainment. The verdict was foregone. And Ruth Snyder, with her blonde hair and her fashionable dresses and her apparent composure in the face of death, became the most hated woman in America. The trial revealed warning signs that should have prevented Albert Snyder's death, signs that were visible to anyone who cared to look, and that were ignored by everyone who should have intervened. Witnesses testified in clinical detail about Ruth's previous attempts on her husband's life. A neighbor described the night the gas had been left running, when Albert had woken choking and stumbled to open a window. A pharmacist testified about purchases of bichloride of mercury, a known poison, that Ruth had made in the months before the murder. A friend recalled conversations in which Ruth had speculated with disturbing casualness about what might happen if Albert were to die suddenly. Albert Snyder had survived at least 3 murder attempts without apparently recognizing the pattern. Or perhaps he had recognized it and chosen not to believe what the evidence suggested. Perhaps he could not accept that the woman who shared his bed, who raised his daughter, who prepared his meals each evening, was methodically trying to end his life. The dysfunction in the Snyder marriage was laid bare for the jury and the watching public. Witnesses described Albert's emotional absence, his continued devotion to his dead fiancée, the photograph of Jessie that Ruth was forced to see every day of her married life. They described Ruth's increasingly obvious unhappiness, her affair conducted with barely any attempt at concealment, the separate lives the couple lived under the same roof. But no one had intervened. No one had suggested divorce or separation or even counseling. In 1920s America, marriage was still considered permanent, a contract that could not be broken except under the most extreme circumstances. A wife's unhappiness was not grounds for dissolution. It was simply the price of the security that marriage provided. Ruth had seen no legal exit from her situation. Divorce would have been scandalous, ruinous to her reputation, and financially devastating. New York's divorce laws were among the strictest in the nation. Adultery was essentially the only grounds, and proving it required evidence that was difficult to obtain and humiliating to present. Even if Ruth had obtained a divorce, she would have left the marriage with nothing: no house, no income, no social standing. The system that trapped her offered no key, so Ruth had fashioned her own. Here is a question worth considering. Does society bear any responsibility when it offers people no acceptable escape from unbearable situations? Or is personal choice always absolute, regardless of the constraints that shape it? The jury heard this context, the loveless marriage, the emotional neglect, the legal impossibilities, and dismissed it entirely. Ruth Snyder was not a victim of circumstance. She was a calculating killer who had chosen profit over patience, murder over endurance. The context explained nothing. The context excused nothing. Ruth Snyder would pay for her choices with her life. The closing argument stripped away whatever ambiguity remained and presented the jury with a choice that was, in truth, no choice at all. District Attorney Newcomb spoke for the prosecution with a moral certainty that resonated through the crowded courtroom. Ruth Snyder, he declared, was the embodiment of everything wrong with modern America. She was a woman who had betrayed her marriage vows without remorse. She had plotted her husband's death with the cold calculation of an accountant balancing books. She had shown no genuine grief, no authentic horror, no human response to the life she had helped to take. She represented, Newcomb argued, the moral corruption of the Jazz Age, a time when traditional values were crumbling, when women were forgetting their proper roles, when materialism and selfishness had replaced duty and sacrifice. Ruth wanted money. Ruth wanted freedom. Ruth wanted a life of pleasure purchased with her husband's blood. She was not a wife, she was a predator. Judd Gray's attorneys took a markedly different approach, one that would prove equally unsuccessful but far more sympathetic to their client. Edgar Hazelton, Gray's lead counsel, portrayed his client not as a murderer but as a victim. Gray was a weak man, easily led, who had fallen under the spell of a woman far stronger and more ruthless than himself. He was putty in her hands, Hazelton told the jury. She molded him, she shaped him, she turned a law-abiding citizen into a weapon and pointed him at her husband. Gray was not evil, the defense argued. He was merely pathetic, a sad little man who had been destroyed by forces beyond his comprehension. He deserved pity, perhaps even mercy. He did not deserve the electric chair. Ruth's attorneys attempted a similar strategy in reverse, arguing that Gray had been the driving force, that Ruth had been pressured into compliance, that the murder was his idea executed with her reluctant assistance. But this defense collapsed under cross-examination, when Ruth's own testimony proved contradictory, unconvincing, and frequently interrupted by the prosecution's devastating questions. He could not explain the insurance policies. She could not explain the previous murder attempts. She could not explain why, if she was Gray's victim, she had purchased chloroform and helped hold it to her husband's face. The jury retired to deliberate on May 9, 1927. The case had consumed 3 weeks of testimony. The evidence filled volumes. The arguments had been made with passion and precision. The jury returned in 98 minutes. The verdict was unanimous, guilty of first-degree murder, both defendants, no recommendation for mercy. The judge pronounced sentence immediately, his voice steady and without emotion. Ruth Snyder and Judd Gray would die in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. The execution was scheduled for January 1928, 8 months away. Ruth showed no visible reaction to the verdict. Her face remained composed, her posture erect, her expression unreadable. Whatever she felt, terror, despair, rage, resignation, she kept hidden behind a mask that reporters would describe as cold and unnatural. Judd Gray wept. What happened in the months between conviction and execution would add one final, unforgettable chapter to the Snyder-Gray case, a moment captured in a single photograph that would become the most famous image of capital punishment in American history. That photograph was taken illegally by a reporter who smuggled a camera into the execution chamber and risked his career to document Ruth Snyder's final seconds of life. The image would horrify the nation. It would spark debates about press ethics that continue to this day, and it would ensure that Ruth Snyder's death, unlike the quiet deaths of so many other condemned criminals, would never be forgotten. In just a moment, you'll understand why that photograph haunted America for decades. On the night of January 12, 1928, Ruth Snyder became the first woman executed in New York State in 29 years, and her death was witnessed by more people than any execution in American history. The electric chair at Sing Sing prison had been prepared with meticulous care. Both executions would occur the same night in the same chair, separated by only minutes. Ruth would die first, Judd would follow. The hours before her execution, Ruth received final visits from her family, from her priest, from the attorneys who had failed to save her life. She wrote letters, their contents never made public, and prayed with a Catholic chaplain who had attended her throughout her imprisonment. According to witnesses, she was calm. Some called it courage. Others called it the same cold composure that had damned her in the eyes of the jury. At 11 o'clock that night, guards came for Ruth Snyder. She walked to the death chamber on her own feet, refusing assistance, her chin held high. She was dressed in a plain brown smock, her blonde hair cropped short to facilitate the electrodes that would deliver the fatal current. Her legs had been shaved. Her head had been shaved in a small patch. Every detail had been calculated for efficiency. The witnesses waited in rows of wooden chairs. Reporters, officials, physicians required to certify death. Among them sat a man who should not have been there. Tom Howard was a photographer for the New York Daily News, one of the tabloids that had profited enormously from the Snyder case. Cameras had been forbidden in execution chambers for decades, a prohibition designed to preserve some dignity in the administration of death. But Howard had other plans. Strapped to his left ankle, concealed beneath his trouser leg, was a miniature camera, a device small enough to escape detection during the cursory security checks. A cable ran from the camera to a trigger hidden in his pocket. He had practiced the motion for weeks. Cross his legs, point his ankle toward the chair, squeeze the trigger. Ruth was strapped into the electric chair. Electrodes were attached to her head and leg. A mask was lowered over her face. The warden gave the signal. At 11:06 p.m., the executioner pulled the switch. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through Ruth Snyder's body. Her muscles contracted. Her body strained against the leather restraints. The smell of burning flesh filled the chamber. And in that moment, the moment of death, Tom Howard crossed his legs, pointed his camera, and clicked the shutter. The photograph he captured was blurred, grainy, almost abstract. It showed Ruth's body at the moment of execution, straining against the restraints, her form distorted by the electricity coursing through her. It was not a clear image. It was not a beautiful image. But it was an image that no one had ever seen before, death by electrocution, captured in the instant it occurred. The New York Daily News published the photograph the following morning. It filled the entire front page. The headline was a single word, printed in letters 2 inches tall. Dead. The photograph caused an immediate sensation. Religious leaders denounced it as ghoulish. Politicians condemned it as exploitative. Ethicists debated whether the public had any right to witness such an intimate moment of state-sanctioned death. And readers bought more than 1 million copies, making it one of the best-selling newspaper editions in American history. Ruth Snyder died at 11:06 p.m. Judd Gray followed at 11:14 p.m., dying in the same chair, still warm from Ruth's body, executed by the same current that had ended her life 8 minutes earlier. Neither expressed remorse in their final moments. Neither admitted sole responsibility. They went to their death still blaming each other, still insisting that the other had been the true architect of Albert Snyder's murder. The double indemnity that Ruth had planned so carefully, the fortune that was supposed to buy her freedom, was never collected. Insurance companies voided every policy, citing fraud and murder as grounds for nullification. Ruth's daughter, Lorraine, was left with nothing but the memory of parents who had destroyed each other and the photograph that ensured no one would ever forget how her mother died. The execution of Ruth Snyder and Judd Gray provoked immediate reaction and lasting debate that extended far beyond the specific facts of their case. Critics condemned the sensationalism that had surrounded the proceedings from the moment of Albert Snyder's death. The trial had been conducted less like a legal proceeding than a theatrical production, with assigned seating, celebrity spectators, and daily coverage that treated murder as entertainment. The execution had been attended by witnesses who had no official purpose, admitted solely because of their connections or their employer's desire for exclusive coverage. And the photograph, that terrible, unforgettable photograph, had crossed a line that many believed should never be crossed. The state had the right to execute criminals, critics argued, but it did not have the right to turn those executions into spectacles. Death should be administered with solemnity, not documented for profit. The New York Daily News defended its decision vigorously. The public, the paper argued, had a right to see how justice was administered. If the state was going to kill its citizens, those killings should not occur in secret. The photograph was journalism, uncomfortable perhaps, but necessary. Tom Howard, the photographer who had risked his career for the image, became briefly famous. He gave interviews. He explained his methods. He defended his actions as a service to the public interest. Then he disappeared into obscurity, his name forgotten while the photograph he had taken remained seared into the national consciousness. But the deeper questions the case had raised remained unanswered. Had justice truly been served? Ruth Snyder had certainly killed her husband or conspired with Gray to do so. The evidence was overwhelming. The verdict was appropriate under the law as it existed. Yet something about the case felt unequal, unbalanced, weighted by factors that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. Judd Gray had struck the fatal blows. Judd Gray had wielded the sash weight and tightened the garrote. Judd Gray had ended Albert Snyder's life with his own hands while Ruth watched. But Judd Gray had been treated, from the beginning of the investigation to the moment of his death, as Ruth's victim rather than her equal partner in murder. He was weak where she was strong. He was led where she led. He was a puppet whose strings had been pulled by a master manipulator. Ruth went to the electric chair as a femme fatale, a dangerous woman whose sexuality had corrupted a decent man and led him to damnation. It was a narrative that said more about 1920s anxieties regarding female power than about the facts of the case. And it ensured that Ruth Snyder would be remembered not simply as a murderer, but as a monster. The Snyder-Gray case produced accountability of the most final kind. 2 lives ended by the state in payment for 1 life taken by its citizens. But questions lingered about whether that accountability had been evenly distributed. Both Ruth and Judd paid with their lives. Both confessed to participation in Albert Snyder's murder. Both were convicted by the same jury and sentenced by the same judge. By every legal measure, they were treated identically. But the court of public opinion operated by different rules. The newspapers that covered the case drew sharp distinctions between the defendants. Ruth was portrayed as the mastermind, the seductress, the spider at the center of a web of manipulation. Her intelligence was evidence of calculation. Her composure was evidence of coldness. Her attractiveness was evidence of the weapons she had used to ensnare her hapless lover. Judd, by contrast, was treated almost sympathetically. He was a small man, a weak man, a man so thoroughly dominated by Ruth that he could not have resisted her commands even if he had wanted to. His tears in the courtroom were interpreted as evidence of genuine remorse. His claims of manipulation were treated as credible explanations rather than self-serving excuses. This narrative ignored facts that should have been impossible to overlook. Judd Gray was a grown man of 34 when he met Ruth Snyder. He was a husband and father, a businessman who traveled extensively and made his own decisions every day. He chose to begin an affair with a married woman. He chose to continue that affair for 2 years. He chose to enter the Snyder home with a weapon. He chose to use that weapon to kill a sleeping man. His weakness of character, even if genuine, did not excuse his actions. Weak men are still capable of murder. Manipulated men still make choices. Yet somehow, in the coverage and commentary that surrounded the case, Gray's weakness became a mitigating factor, while Ruth's strength became an aggravating one. Here is another question worth considering. Why do we find it easier to blame a woman for manipulation than a man for violence? And what does that asymmetry reveal about the assumptions we bring to questions of guilt and responsibility? Ruth Snyder was held to a standard that Judd Gray never faced. She was punished more severely by history, if not by law. Her photograph became the enduring image of the case. Her name remained infamous for decades while Gray's faded into footnotes. The message was unmistakable. A woman who stepped outside her prescribed role, who used her intelligence and her sexuality to achieve her goals, who refused to accept the limitations that society imposed. Such a woman deserved not just death, but eternal condemnation. Whether Albert Snyder, cold and indifferent and still devoted to a woman dead for 20 years, deserved any sympathy at all was a question that no one thought to ask. Ruth Snyder and Judd Gray were buried separately, their deaths ending the affair that had begun with a chance meeting and ended in the execution chamber. Ruth was interred at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, far from Albert, whose grave she had helped to fill, far from her daughter whose life she had shattered, far from the Queen's home where she had lived her suffocating marriage and planned her husband's murder. Her grave bears a simple marker, rarely visited, largely forgotten by a public that once could not stop talking about her. Judd Gray was buried in New Jersey, near the family he had betrayed. His widow, who had stood by him through the trial with a dignity that earned her sympathy she had never sought, eventually took their daughter and moved away. They changed their names. They built new lives. They tried with limited success to escape the shadow of January 12, 1928. But the cruelest fate belonged to the person who had committed no crime at all. Lorraine Snyder was just 9 years old when her mother was executed, old enough to understand what was happening, too young to process it, and utterly helpless to prevent it. Her father had been murdered by her mother. Her mother had been killed by the state. She was left an orphan, raised by relatives who tried, with varying degrees of success, to shield her from the notoriety that would follow her for the rest of her life. In interviews conducted decades later, Lorraine described a childhood defined by whispers and stares. She was the daughter of that woman, the child of the most hated woman in America, the offspring of a murderer whose photograph dying in the electric chair had been seen by millions. She changed her name repeatedly. She moved from city to city. She married and divorced. She never escaped her mother's shadow. "People think they know who I am because of what she did," Lorraine said in one of her rare public statements. "But I'm not her, I never was, and I never got the chance to just be myself." The murder that Ruth Snyder had committed for money left her daughter with nothing. Not the inheritance Ruth had imagined, not the comfortable life the insurance money was supposed to provide, not even the anonymity that might have allowed a normal existence. The double indemnity paid nothing. The price was everything. The Snyder Gray case cast a shadow that extended far beyond the lives it directly touched, shaping law, culture, and the national conversation about crime and punishment for decades to come. Famous execution photograph sparked a debate about press access that transformed the administration of capital punishment in America. Within years of Ruth's death, cameras were permanently banned from execution chambers across the country. Witnesses were limited to official observers and designated family members. The spectacle that had surrounded Ruth's death was deliberately eliminated, replaced by procedures designed to minimize public attention. Tom Howard's photograph became the last of its kind, a frozen moment from an era when death could be documented and distributed, before privacy and dignity became values that extended even to the condemned. The case also inspired a wave of cultural production that explored the themes underlying the murder: adultery, greed, manipulation, and the lengths to which ordinary people would go for money and freedom from constraint. James M. Cain, a novelist fascinated by the intersection of sex and violence, drew directly from the Snyder case when he wrote Double Indemnity in 1943. The story of a scheming wife and her insurance salesman lover plotting murder was lifted almost directly from the Queen's courthouse transcripts. The 1944 film adaptation, directed by Billy Wilder and starring Barbara Stanwyck and Fred MacMurray, became a cornerstone of film noir and cemented the image of the murderous blonde as a cultural archetype that persists to this day. The Postman Always Rings Twice, published by Kane in 1934, drew from the same well of inspiration. So did countless other novels, films, and television programs that explored the deadly possibilities inherent in unhappy marriages and insurance policies. Ruth Snyder became, in death, something she had never been in life, an icon. She represented the dangers of female ambition unchecked by conscience. She embodied the corruption of consumer culture, the hollow promises of the American dream, the moral decay that critics saw in modern womanhood. Whether this representation bore any resemblance to the actual Ruth Snyder, the woman who had grown up poor and married for security, who had endured a loveless marriage and sought escape through an affair, who had made terrible choices that destroyed everyone they touched, was a question the cultural machinery never bothered to answer. Ruth was more useful as a symbol than as a person, and symbols don't require nuance or understanding. They require only repetition. Ruth Snyder's story brings the anthology of Gilded Age wives to its logical, chilling conclusion, and forces us to confront the uncomfortable patterns that connect these seemingly disparate cases. Florence Maybrick was trapped by an older husband who may have been slowly poisoning himself, a man whose violence was public knowledge and whose own habits may have caused his death. Lizzie Borden was trapped by a father who favored his wife over his daughters, whose will would have stripped them of their inheritance, whose household was a pressure cooker of resentment and jealousy. Maria Barbella was trapped by a man who destroyed her and laughed about it, who took her honor and refused even the pretense of making it right. Ruth Snyder was trapped by nothing more than her own desires. She wanted money, she wanted freedom, she wanted a life beyond the suffocating respectability of her queen's home and her indifferent husband, and she was willing to kill for it, not in a moment of passion, not in response to violence, but through cold calculation extending over years. The other women in this documentary can claim, with varying degrees of credibility, that circumstance drove them to violence, that they faced situations with no acceptable exits, that their choices were constrained by forces beyond their control. Ruth Snyder cannot make that claim. She planned Albert's death methodically, carefully, with the patience of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and was willing to wait for the right moment. She made multiple attempts before succeeding. She showed no genuine remorse when caught, only calculation about how to minimize her punishment. And yet, even Ruth's case reveals something troubling about the position of women in early 20th century America. Divorce was theoretically available, but practically ruinous. Separation meant poverty. Independence required resources that most women lacked and opportunities that most women were denied. The only exit from an unhappy marriage that left a woman with resources and respectability was the husband's death. Ruth chose to hasten that death. She chose wrong. But we should not pretend that she chose in a vacuum. The electricity that killed Ruth Snyder in January 1928 marked more than the end of her life. It marked the end of an era. The trapped wives of the Gilded Age, with their poisons and their axes and their carefully staged accidents, gave way to something different as the 20th century progressed. Women gained the vote. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers. Women gained legal rights that made exit from marriage possible, if still difficult. The desperation that had driven Florence and Lizzie and Maria and Ruth, the sense that there was no way out except through blood, began slowly to ease. Their stories remain as warnings. They remain as cautionary tales about what happens when society traps people in impossible situations and offers no legitimate escape. And they remain as reminders of how quickly ordinary people can become capable of extraordinary violence when they see no other path forward. The question is not whether these women were guilty. Most of them were. The question is what made them that way. The electric chair that killed Ruth Snyder has been retired, replaced by lethal injection, then questioned, then defended, then questioned again as America continues its endless debate about the morality of state-sanctioned death. The prison where she died has been transformed. The newspapers that made her famous have mostly folded, victims of changing technology and changing tastes. But her story persists, not because Ruth Snyder was unusual, but because she represented something that American society desperately wanted to condemn and could not entirely escape. She was a woman who wanted more than she had been given. She was a wife who refused to accept the bargain she had made. She was a mother who, in the end, chose herself over her family and lost everything in the choosing. These were unforgivable sins in 1927. They remain uncomfortable truths today. We still struggle with women who want too much, who refuse to accept their circumstances, who prioritize their own desires over their family's needs. Ruth Snyder was guilty of murder. Of that, there can be no reasonable doubt. But she was also guilty of ambition, of desire, of refusing to stay in her place. And for those secondary crimes, she was punished not just with death, but with a legacy of hatred that has outlasted the lives of everyone who knew her. A photograph of her execution, her body rigid against the restraints, her face obscured by the mask, electricity making visible its invisible violence, became the symbol of her story. It told viewers exactly what they wanted to believe, that women who killed deserved to die and that their death should be witnessed by all who might be tempted to follow their example. Whether this was justice or spectacle, punishment or entertainment, remains a question without a comfortable answer. Ruth Snyder answered it with her life. The rest of us are left with the asking. We began this documentary by asking what makes a wife become a killer. The 4 women whose stories we have examined offered 4 different answers, and yet beneath the surface differences, a common pattern emerges. Florence Maybrick may have killed to escape a violent husband who poisoned himself and struck her in public, a man whose own habits created the conditions for his death. Lizzie Borden almost certainly killed to protect an inheritance she saw slipping away, to remove a stepmother who threatened the security she believed she deserved. BARBELLA killed to avenge the destruction of her honor, to punish a man who had laughed at her suffering and offered nothing in return. Ruth Snyder killed for money, pure and simple, cold and calculated, planned over years and executed without apparent remorse. Desperation, greed, revenge, calculation. The motives differ, the methods vary, but the pattern persists. In an era when women had few options for legitimate escape, when divorce was scandalous, independence was almost impossible, and unhappy marriages were considered simply the cost of the security that women were taught to value above all else, some women found their own exits. They found them through arsenic slipped into medicine and axes wielded in summer heat. They found them through razors drawn across sleeping throats and sash weights swung in darkened bedrooms. They found them through violence that shocked the societies that had offered them no alternatives. Were they villains? Were they victims? The honest answer for most of them is both. They were women who ran out of acceptable choices, and when the acceptable choices ended, they made unacceptable ones. History has judged them harshly. Perhaps history should also judge the circumstances that created them. The question that remains after all these stories is not about guilt or innocence. The evidence, in most cases, speaks clearly enough to settle those matters. The question is about responsibility. When society traps people in impossible situations, who bears responsibility for what they do to escape? When marriage becomes a prison with no legal key, is the violence of the prisoner entirely her fault? Or does some portion of the blame belong to those who built the prison and refused to provide an exit? The Gilded Age offered women security in exchange for submission. When submission became unbearable, some women chose a different exchange, freedom in exchange for blood. We condemn them for that choice. Perhaps we should also ask why those were the only choices available. Florence Maybrick served 15 years for a murder she may not have committed, punished more for adultery than for any proven crime. Lizzie Borden walked free despite evidence that would have convicted almost anyone else, saved by her social position and her society's inability to believe that a respectable woman could wield an axe. BARBELLA was sentenced to die, then saved by a public outcry that recognized her desperation even as it condemned her violence. Ruth Snyder died in the electric chair, her photograph published for millions to witness, her story transformed into a warning for any woman who might think to follow her path. 4 women, 4 fates, 4 answers to the same question. And one question that remains, after all the evidence has been examined and all the verdicts have been rendered. What do we owe the people we trap? We've now witnessed 4 of the most shocking murder cases in American history, crimes that exposed the dark underbelly of marriages that looked respectable from the outside and concealed desperation, rage, and violence within. But the wives of the Gilded Age weren't the only ones willing to kill for money, for freedom, or for revenge. In our next documentary, we examine the other side of this deadly equation, the husbands who murdered their wives and got away with it. From the horrors discovered in Dr. Crippen's cellar to the insurance killers of the 1930s who collected on policies their dead wives never knew existed, we'll explore how society treated male violence against women in an era when a wife was still considered, in many ways, her husband's property. We'll examine cases where confessed murderers served minimal sentences or walked free entirely, protected by laws and attitudes that assumed men had reasons for their violence that women could not claim. If you found these stories compelling, that documentary is waiting for you right now. Click the link appearing on your screen or find it in our channel library. And subscribe so you don't miss our weekly deep dives into the cases that history tried to forget. Because the past isn't dead, it's just waiting to be remembered. These 4 women shared something beyond their crimes. They each discovered that the security marriage promised came with a price far higher than they had imagined. If their stories resonated with you, Explore our full library of documentaries examining the forgotten scandals and hidden crimes that shaped American history. Start with The Husbands Who Got Away with Murder, where we examine the other side of this deadly equation. That documentary is waiting for you right now. And leave a comment below. Which of these 4 cases do you think was most unjust and why? We read every response.